So Daggerheart came out a couple months ago, and I, being a big fan of D&D, Critical Role, and TTRPGs in general, did you hear that I'm making one? I thought I'd finally pull the trigger and download the full PDF off the internet for free. I mean, Critical Role is making millions, one lost sale isn't going to kill them, right? But back when Daggerheart first released, I watched some reviews on them and found those videos to be lacking in detail, to put it nicely. I get TTRPGs are big and have a lot of pages in them, but skimming the book once and making a video about your thoughts on it that is only like 10 to 30 minutes long at most is pretty lame. I think the counter argument to this might be that people don't like hour-long videos or longer, but just looking up video essays on YouTube view counts, I think the argument is easily dismissed. Not to mention that Critical Role sessions are consistently like 4 hours long, so Critical Role fans are definitely accustomed to watching long videos. And since no one else has done it, I guess I'm up. So I've DM'd and been playing D&D for years now, and the people I can credit to getting me into it all is Critical Role. I think a lot of people can say the same, and a lot has happened in the years since Critical Role first started, like a decade ago. A global pandemic that everyone kind of just forgot about, the OGL crisis along with a lot of other fucked up shit Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro did and forever tarnished their reputation, and now Critical Role has finally released their first real SRD. Although I guess we don't really talk about the other TTRPGs they've come out with over the years. Between the OGL crisis and Critical Role becoming a real business during the pandemic, the creation of their own SRD was really an inevitability to make sure that CR never really had to rely on Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro ever again, even though they're still using D&D for Campaign 4. But is their new game a cash grab that exists only to cover their asses illegally, or a genuine attempt at creating a true competitor to Dungeons & Dragons as a game and brand? Let's see just how good Daggerheart really is. So why should you take my opinion seriously? In short, you shouldn't. I'm just some dude on YouTube speaking about this game I was hyped for like 3 years ago when it was first announced, and then Critical Role Campaign 3 came out and was terrible. In between that and the more corporate feel to everything Critical Role is now, I'm no longer a really big fan of Critical Role, so keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that I haven't actually played Daggerheart yet. I have read the book, but I haven't actually played it. And to be fair, a lot of the people who made reviews on Daggerheart back when it first came out and even after also hadn't played the game yet. They just read the book and just talked about their thoughts about it. My D&D group is already rotating between like 3 campaigns, and if I was going to get some actual play in with this system, I would have had to wait months to fit it into the schedule. So keep in mind that I am judging this game just by looking at the rules as they are written, without the experience of actually playing the game. That being said, I did watch Critical Role's Age of Umbra mini-campaign for this review, so I'm not completely without understanding how this game is meant to be used in a real game in real time. I'm going to be comparing Daggerheart to D&D 5e a lot. It's the game Critical Role started with and became famous through playing, sort of. I mean, they sort of started with Pathfinder technically, and it's the game I began playing thanks to them. Daggerheart takes a lot of cues and directions from D&D, and along with Critical Role's history with it, I think it's more than fair to compare the two. I will also be bringing up my own game, Mythic at Any Cost, shameless plug, because I have worked hard on it over the last 2 years to address common issues D&D 5e has, and I am very interested as a game maker in what Daggerheart did differently than me to address such issues. I'm not going to go through the entire game in extensive detail, despite my previous complaints about people's reviews being too brief. That would make for just far too massive a video I'm not willing to make. So there will be some things I will likely skip over just because I might not think it's important to talk about. This review/critique is mostly focused on the mechanics of Daggerheart rather than the lore or settings. The things like the campaign frames I will not be going over. Also, to get this out of the way right away, the book visually looks fantastic, very high quality looking product. And since I was not able to play Daggerheart myself, I have no footage to show the game itself. So for the visual elements of this video, I will have Baldur's Gate 3 gameplay in the background, along with pages from Daggerheart's SRD. So on page 4 of the book, Daggerheart goes over some basic introduction stuff, like what a TTRPG is. But Daggerheart describes itself in an interesting way. It describes itself as a heroic narrative-focused experience, which can be a description for just about any fantasy TTRPG, but also says it heavily features combat. The section then goes on to talk about how it takes a fiction-first approach, which again can be said about any TTRPG, but something that made me raise an eyebrow is when it said, quote, encouraging players and GMs to act in good faith with one another and focus on the story they're telling rather than the complexity of the mechanics, end quote. So right away, this game is setting up a certain expectation. I think problematic players that you hear about online on Reddit or YouTube are much more uncommon than people might think, and most players do not come to the table, however often you might play, looking to derail or destroy the game. But making a game whose rule set is based around something as nebulous as good faith is a problem, because even players who are not interested in acting malicious or going out of their way to destroy the game's narrative will still seek out to give themselves as many bonuses as possible in any and every situation, not just related to combat. You know, it's like a rogue arguing that they should be able to hide in dim light from a creature despite not breaking line of sight, or a paladin arguing that they should be able to smite from a range because throwing a weapon still might count as a melee attack. Arguments that typically come from newer and less experienced players that are just trying to flex their creative skills when approaching game mechanics, but they have no idea how broken certain classes or mechanics will become if the DM did say yes to these arguments. Players are not coming from a place of bad faith, so what exactly does good faith mean? This section then talks about how initiative and battle maps work in basic terms. I'll talk about those things more when we get there. The section continues, quote, "If you're looking for a TTRPG that tells heroic fantasy stories with a modern approach to mechanics," end quote. That's Daggerheart describing itself. I'm sorry if it seems like I'm going into way too much detail about just a simple couple of paragraphs at the very start of the book, but this is the book's intro, its first impression to the player, and it makes a lot of claims that seem like empty fluff that doesn't help me understand the game at all. Like, modern approach to mechanics, what does that even mean? It also details that there is asymmetric design between DM and PC. I'll talk about that more when we get there as well. The Heart of the Game section essentially just describes how fantasy TTRPGs are played, nothing major there. The ruling over rules section is interesting. I generally agree that rulings are more important than rules, but at the same time, I think following the rules is important. They exist for a reason. They're not guidelines, they're rules. But bending rules for a cool moment can make for situations that your players will never forget. This section uses the game's grappler as an example. Quote, "Daggerheart has a weapon called a grappler that lets you pull a target close to you. If you're trying to use it to pull an entire castle, the weapon text doesn't forbid you from doing that, but it doesn't make sense within the narrative. Instead, the GM might rule that you will pull a few bricks out or pull yourself towards the wall instead." End quote. This is an interesting example because the game makers point out an issue in their game and essentially say DMs need to figure it out. The game makers could easily add a sentence to the grapplers saying that only works on creatures of certain size categories, like a medium or smaller, or have a weight limit to how much it can pull, but instead they put the limits of the item based solely on what the DM is willing to allow. It comes off as lazy to me, because describing some basic limits to the item's functionality really only requires a sentence at most to describe. I looked ahead at weapons and found the grappler's description, which reads, quote, "On successful attack, you can pull the target into melee range," end quote. The rules as written, this description says a lot with only a sentence. The grappler's effect only works when successfully landing an attack, and you can only pull a target into melee. I looked ahead again and found out what target specifically means in this game, and it refers to creatures or objects. This description does a great job at describing what it can do with only a sentence, but it does a terrible job at describing what it can't do. Like I said before, one more sentence describing a weight limit or size category limit would have been more than enough to describe clear boundaries to what this item can and cannot do. And without clear boundaries for what this weapon will do, players will attempt to rule lawyer their way into doing some kooky stuff with this weapon. Guarantee it. Because rule lawyers typically are not coming from a place of bad faith, they're simply attempting to get themselves as many advantages in a situation as possible, especially in high stress situations like a narratively important combat is decided between the BBEG getting his hands on the MacGuffin or not, and you could stop the BBEG from doing so by simply locking him sort of in place by hitting him with the grappler over and over, because the grappler doesn't have a save. The grappler's range is also close, as well, which means a range of about 30 feet. In Daggerheart, on a player move, they can move at a distance equal to close range. So if an enemy that uses a grappler focuses down a player that likes to stay ranged and does poorly in melee, then they're kind of fucked if they don't do the dash equivalent in Daggerheart. All the enemy needs to do on their turn is to move their normal distance to get back into range. I think the dash action in this game is weird as well. You have to make an agility check, and then if you pass, it's kind of unclear how far you can move. I have an item like this in my game, Mythic. It's called a hook shot. The hook shot in Mythic reads, quote, "Mounted on the forearm, fired like a gun. Rapidly pulls the user towards the surface the hook shot was fired at. The hook is connected to the launcher by metal wiring and is very strong. DR25 to hit/break the cable. Refer to materials to know the AR of different materials. If the cable is hit once, it breaks. You may also use this item on targets, like a soldier or robot. If you successfully hit a target and do damage, you may yank the target towards you. To do so, you and the target must make a contested roll by rolling an athletics check, and the target makes either an athletics check or acrobatics check. Whoever's roll is higher wins the roll. You cannot yank a target to you if their size is larger than you. If you do not yank the target cannot move away from you, but can still move in circular motion around you. When hitting a target the same size or larger than you, You can use this item to zip to the target rapidly to get into melee range. To do this, you must successfully land a hit on the target and do damage. Shooting the hookshot and then zipping to where you hooked to, or yank a target, is all part of the same 2 action. The description could definitely be fixed up a little bit, and I'm currently working on the game's first big revision after a recent playtest, but I think the hookshot description is a lot better than the grapplers in Daggerheart. While yes, it has a much longer description and players might not like that, it is also very specific in what it can and cannot do. Its cable can be broken if its armor rating of 25 is met or beaten. It doesn't have a health pool. Once it's hit, it's broken, and pulling targets toward you requires a contested roll rather than just working, which makes the item far less abusable. Of course, there are some details about how the hookshot works that could be expanded upon or added to, but generally I agree that Daggerheart's philosophy that not everything needs to be defined in endless detail can make it functional and useful in-game. The issue with Daggerheart is that it's using such a game design philosophy to justify not really defining the limits in their game much at all. So yeah, I went into way too much depth about one section and one item in this game, which might have been unnecessary, but I think this one item says a lot about Daggerheart's game design. That a lot of things are not defined well and can be easily exploited by any player. Simply saying that a player should approach the game with good faith doesn't really stop players from trying to bend rules as much as they can to ensure the best possible outcomes in most situations. The Rulings over Rules section also mentions that if players do something incredibly short-sighted, like purposely hopping into lava, the DM can forego letting the players using the death options in the game and just have the PC die, which makes a lot of sense. For the player's principle section, I don't have much to say. I like what it generally said in this section, but none of it is new. It's the kind of stuff any experienced DM would have already learned through playing other TTRPGs, even if those TTRPGs do not explicitly state some of this stuff, like spotlighting characters and what they're good at every session. Finally getting into Chapter 1. It gets into some basic descriptions of a world a player party adventure might take place in. As I said, this video is more interested in critiquing the mechanics of the game rather than its lore, so I'm skipping this section. It's just talking about like the different realms, like how, you know, in normal D&D you have the material plane, and then you have like hell, and then heaven, and then plane of fire and plane of earth and things like that. For character creation, much like in any other TTRPG, you begin the game by making a character. The order of making a character goes as thus: choose your class, choose your heritage, assign character traits, additional info, starting equipment, create background, create your experiences, choose your domain cards, create your connections. You begin by choosing a class and subclass. It's nice that you get your subclass right away in this game. One of the most annoying things in D&D is that for most classes, you have to wait a few levels to get your subclasses. There are 9 classes in Daggerheart: Bard, Druid, Guardian, Ranger, Rogue, Seraph, Sorcerer, and Wizard. Each class has 2 subclasses you can pick that work like how they do in D&D, giving your character additional abilities that help differentiate them from others of the same class. Not a ton of options for subclasses, but neither did D&D 5e or 5.5e when they launched. Each class has a character sheet that is pretty much the same as each other, but the bottom left section includes a class feature that is different per which class you picked, along with the amount of health and amount of stress you have being different amounts. Kinda necessary to make different character sheets for every class when the only thing that is different about them is what's in the bottom left corner and how many health and stress points you have. It's information that could have been turned into an info card or something that could be filled out by the player rather than making a bunch of minor variants. Like the HP and stress have dotted outlines for additional slots you might get later in the game, or from racial bonuses. Why not make them all dotted outlines and let players fill them in? It differentiates further when looking at the character guides that are like extensions to the basic character sheet. They are additional pieces of paper that has a lot of basic information on it about your class, along with suggested ways of building a class. Not sure why recommended ways of building a class is on the sheet, meant to help players keep track of what their character can do after the character is made. I'd rather have that area be left blank to be used for notes or something. The rest of the stuff in the character guide is actually useful post level 1. It shows background questions, which can be great for getting players to think about backstory, but also remember their backstory, and a connection section to track your past history with other PCs. There's also a section for character tiers, which I will get into more later. Next we choose our heritage. Heritage is like picking your race in D&D, but there is an interesting twist to it. Instead of just picking a race, you also pick what part of society you're from. I like this because what part of society a player's PC is from is often mentioned when they are describing their character and their backstory, or to other players when first introducing them. So it's fun to see a mechanical bonus based on which part of society they are from. This is called a community feature. My only issue with the community feature being that the bonuses are a little vague. You see, there are no skills in Daggerhearts. There are only the base stats, which are called traits in this game. Where D&D has 18 skills and are all influenced by different base stats along with proficiencies, Daggerheart just has the base 6 traits that are used in place of skills. So when you would make an athletics check in D&D, in Daggerheart you must make a strength check. I like this because there is less for players to track, and stats can be used as umbrella skills that cover a lot of things. It might cause issues on what trait applies to what action, but unlike spells and items, I think that's okay for traits and their applications to be a little more vague. Traits cover things that we as humans understand their limits to on a fundamental level. We can literally apply our real-world experience to what these traits can and cannot do. Getting back to my issue with the community feature, take the Ridgeborn for instance. Their community feature is, quote, "You have advantage on rolls to traverse dangerous cliffs and ledges, navigate harsh environments, and use your survival knowledge," end quote. I think I went in deep on the Grappler earlier for having too vague of descriptions, but the same goes for this community feature. Dangerous cliffs and ledges are clear, but what about harsh environments? A swamp and desert can equally be seen as a harsh environment, but the description of Ridgeborn, along with the illustrations on the page, depict a rocky and arid landscape. So should the advantage be applied only when they are in a landscape similar to their homeland, or any kind of land? Because I guarantee even good-intentioned players will try to milk this advantage for everything it's worth. I mean, hell, a forest could be considered a harsh environment. Plenty of people have died in national parks because they got lost and ran out of water. The same argument goes for the use your survival knowledge part. It's just very vague. Another example can be the Slyborn. Their community feature is, quote, "You have advantage on rolls to negotiate with criminals, detect lies, and find a safe place to hide," end quote. This one is better, but still kind of vague when it comes to negotiating with criminals. Like, what constitutes a criminal? I know I might sound pedantic right now, but this minor distinction has definitely come up in my sessions before, either for my own game or D&D. Like, does a poor person that stole a piece of bread count as a criminal on the same level as an active assassin or a Thieves Guild member? Or is a noble who actually acts noble other than they skip some tax payments once a month also count as a criminal? You can have a noble that is clean, no history of crime at all, but as soon as players find out that they didn't pay all his taxes 1 month, I guarantee you players will try to argue that the noble is now considered a criminal and that Slyborn characters deserve advantage when negotiating with them. And this is partly why, despite D&D having so many skills that can be annoying to track and some being borderline useless, giving racial bonuses to base stats or skills, I think, is a better system, because how skills are used are better defined compared to how they are used in Daggerheart. For instance, in D&D, a background/class feature/racial bonus might give you proficiency in deception, which allows you to add your proficiency modifier to deception checks. This is better than having an advantage on negotiating with criminals because it gives you a bonus on how you choose to engage with the NPC, rather than relying on what the NPC is. The second part of Heritage is picking an ancestry. This is much more like how it works in D&D and most other TTRPGs. There is a list of races or species that you can pick from, and it gives you racial bonuses, but it's called an ancestry feature in this game. I like the ancestry features a lot more than the community ones because they are more specific and actionable. For humans, their feature is high stamina, gain an additional stress slot at character creation, and adaptability. When you fail a roll that utilizes one of your experiences, you can mark a stress to re-roll. Gaining additional stress at the start of the game is easy to apply and you never really have to think about it again. And allowing yourself to use a stress to re-roll a roll using your experience is very specific. The same goes for most races in this game. The visual designs of races in Daggerheart, for the most part, they are nothing to write home about. They're your typical fantasy races: dwarf, elf, orc. Pretty much all of them are exactly what they look like in D&D, but the standout designs, I think, is the fairy, because their silhouette is still the typical fantasy design of a small, thin person, but the details of their design is insectoid. I don't know if this has been done before, but it's pretty novel to me. Plus, from the sketches, it looks like you can play as a beetle person, which is pretty fucking sick. Except the feature describing their flight ability is vague, like, is my fly speed the same as my walk speed or what? I've already talked about traits a little bit earlier. There are no skills in Daggerheart, so traits are umbrella skills that also function as your base stats that are used for everything. There is agility, strength, finesse, instinct, presence, and knowledge. Agility, unlike dexterity, seems to cover all forms of movement, unlike in D&D, where parkour and balancing is influenced by dex, and running up hills and climbing was handled by strength. I think this is a fine change and optimizes the game a bit. Finesse is the stealth skill. There is no counterpart to it in D&D, rather in that game you added your dex to stealth or sleight of hand or something. Again, I like this change because it optimizes the game, reducing how much stuff you have to reference when making rolls. All other traits function like the stats in D&D with minor changes for the most part. I think the first thing you'll notice though is that if you play a lot of D&D, the traits only have modifiers. In D&D, stats get standard array of 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8, or you can point by. It's interesting because it looks like Daggerheart took the standard array modifier of +2, +2, +1, +1, +0, and -1, and lowered 1 + 2 by 1 and 1 + 1 by 1 and decided that that will be Daggerheart's standard array. I like this because the base stats in D&D have always felt kind of weird. You put 15 in stat level 1, but then you have to convert it into a modifier, which is the actual number you'll be referencing for your ability checks and other rules. You almost never actually reference the stat number that ranges from 8 to 15. So from an optimization standpoint, this makes a lot of sense to me, and it reduces how much stuff players need to track and definitely frees up some room on your character sheet. I know firsthand that something a lot of new players get tripped up on in character creation is that they put a number into stats, but then have to convert it into a smaller number right away that act as their modifiers. Choosing starting equipment is mostly the same as D&D. There's a little more freedom to it since there is no weapon proficiencies. Instead, you pick a two-handed weapon or a one-handed weapon and then a second one-handed weapon. But now we get to choosing your armor, and I skipped over setting your evasion earlier because I want to talk about evasion and armor together. So in D&D, you have armor class, which is shortened to AC. AC is a number set by your dexterity modifier plus the armor you're wearing. For light armor, it gives you a small AC, but you can add your entire dexterity modifier to it. Medium gives you more AC, but you can only add at maximum +2 of your dex modifier to it. And heavy armor gives you the most AC, but you can't add any of your dexterity modifier to it. And so AC is a number where enemies must roll to hit it, and if they roll equal or higher than your AC, they hit you and do some damage. First, calculating AC out of combat can be a bit much, but once you get a handle on it, it's pretty easy to understand. Plus, the AC system is brain dead easy to understand and engage with pretty much constantly in combat, since all enemies do in combat is try to hit you and do damage. Daggerheart has a very similar system, but calls it evasion, and you don't add any of your benefits from your armor or agility trait to your evasion. Your evasion is set by the class you picked at the start of the game. So for the human warrior example I have made, my evasion is set to 11 with no other nuances. Okay, so evasion isn't that hard to understand. In fact, it's easier to understand than D&D's AC system because you don't have varying AC based on which armor you chose and don't add any stat mod to it. But the really interesting part comes in when looking at Daggerheart's armor system. So far, nothing in this game has been a huge flag for me. It mostly just feels like a less comprehensive and more streamlined version of D&D. But the armor system and evasion, honestly, really makes me not like this game. So how armor works in Daggerheart is that every armor comes with base damage thresholds. I'm already not a fan of damage thresholds in TTRPGs because there are too many different kinds and they can sometimes be complicated. And it seems weirdly common for new game makers to try to use DT in tandem with AC in whatever game they're trying to make. One campaign I play in is a pirate one, and the pirate ships have DT. I don't know about everyone else in my group, but I always groan internally when hearing that we hit the enemy ship with our cannons, beat their AC, but then most, if not all of our damage is negated because the ship has large DT. It just feels bad. Or worse, you could have an AC system and then a DT system, where the damage you do does no damage to the enemy unless the damage beats the DT. And that's only after your attack beats their AC. It's a multi-tiered mess of a system. Daggerheart uses a version of DT I've never seen before, and I don't like it. So in combat, when an enemy meets or beats your evasion and rolls to do damage against you, it works just like in D&D, and enemies roll a couple of die to do somewhere between like 5 to 20 HP worth of damage to you. But since Daggerheart has health pools starting at around 6 HP, you have to take the damage you took from the enemy's attack, compare it to your armor's DT, which has 2 separate thresholds, figure out how many thresholds it beats, and then that determines how much damage you actually took. You also add your level to your DTs, so it's the DTs the armor gives you plus your level. Minor, major, and severe damage is what you suffer based on how much damage you took. Here is the example the book gives on how this works in practice. The armor DT for this example is 8 and 16. Quote, if a guardian's incoming damage is 16 or higher, the damage is severe and they mark 3 hit points. If the damage is 8 or higher, just below 16, the damage is major and they mark 2 hit points. If the damage is below their major threshold of 8, the damage is minor and they mark 1 hit point. So there is an obvious issue going on with this weird system. It's clear that the makers of this game wanted damage to be rolled like how it is in D&D and have players roll dice to total for big numbers when rolling for damage, because That's fun. But they also wanted to streamline the game and make it easier to understand and faster to play, and thus used smaller health pools. Unfortunately, big damage and small health pools don't mix. So when you do try to mix them, you get this weird conversion system like what you have in Daggerheart. The developers wanted their cake and they wanted to eat it too, because now you have a system that is not easy to understand. And that might sound crazy to say, because TTRPG veterans that have likely played several different systems and experienced several different kinds of ACs and DT systems probably have no issue understanding this weird DT and AC system. 5 DM for people who can barely keep up with how AC works in D&D. Why not have it so when you get hit, you just take a point of damage, and when you get hit by like a crit, you suffer 2 points of damage. But rolling a ton of dice for damage is ultimately pointless in Daggerheart because the most damage a player can suffer is 3 HP worth of damage. So rolling so much damage ends up being a waste of time, so in their effort to make the game feel fun, they instead made the game feel less fun by forcing players to constantly engage in a clunky mechanic that is Daggerheart's armor and damage system. The system would be better if the armor mechanic was just cut in favor of having an AC system like in D&D, having players and enemies just take 1 to 3 points of damage when hit. It would also speed up combat a lot. There are also armor slots. Armor slots act kind of like extra HP, since when you get hit and suffer damage, you can spend an armor slot to reduce the damage by 1. So if you suffer a severe damage, you can spend an armor slot to reduce it to minor, or minor to none. You might want to burn all these slots as soon as possible in combat, since practically speaking, you want to lose as little HP as possible in combat. The only issue being that getting armor slots back is a bit of an adventure. Repairing armor is an activity to do during short rests, and you must do it to get armor slots back. They don't just come back by the end of the rest. On a rest, you can take the repair armor action and clear a number of armor slots equal to 1d4 plus your tier. You can do this to allies armor instead if you so choose. This is one of 4 actions you can take during a short rest that all involve getting some resources back. So it's not guaranteed that you'll have all of your armor slots every combat, so it's probably smart to save them to reduce those severe damage hits. So I like the armor slot system in concept, but it is just another resource you have to track as a player. And I really think something this inconsequential doesn't justify being in the game. You could completely take armor slots out of the game and the game wouldn't really change that much, which makes the system feel unneeded. After that, you create your background. Each class has different background questions and you can answer them however you like. It's more for roleplay stuff. Next, you create your experiences. You create 2, and an experience is a short, descriptive phrase that cannot be too vague. For example, silent as the night. So in-game, when you feel like your experience applies to a situation, you can spend a hope and add +2 to whatever roll you're making. So I don't know how many people watching this video have played Lancer, the sci-fi mech TTRPG, but the experience system in Daggerheart is pretty much ripped straight out of that game. In Lancer, it's called triggers, and it mostly works the same way, but it doesn't cost any resources to use, like needing to use hope in Daggerheart. There's nothing wrong with copying systems from other games. I mean, you can't get sued over it or anything because rule sets cannot be copyrighted, and it can be a good starting point for making modified or completely different systems that were based on that system. But in Daggerheart, it's mostly the same as Lancer. The first thing I don't like about experiences, this goes for triggers and Lancers as well, is that they give a player a +2 to their roll instead of advantage. In my most recent playtest of Mythic, where it ran a lot like Daggerheart D&D and other TTRPGs, where a lot of things in the game ranging from abilities to Mythic's versions of spells to items bestow like a +1 or +2 to a roll of some kind. And it got to the point that players were telling me that it was too much. It was too much to track and keep straight, understanding what all goes into making the final modifier of a stat, ability, or accuracy roll. By the end of the playtest, my players told me that a better way of doing it is make it so more things just bestow advantage to players for something rather than having a +1 from like 5 different sources to a single roll. And honestly, I think they're right. For my time being a player in D&D, it can be really tough to keep track of all those +1s, and I think making most bonuses simply give advantage for the roll is a lot easier to understand and track. I forget where I saw it, but you can look it up and find that D&D 5e has literally hundreds of ways to get your character advantage for certain rolls, or any roll, and yet most of the time you won't be rolling with advantage. So why not utilize the mechanics some more? The second thing I don't like about experiences and triggers in Lancer, and why I don't put something like triggers or experiences in my game, Mythic, is that while there are cool ways to express your character's roleplay, mechanically speaking, it is highly abusable. In Lancer, their example is punch face. So whenever you are in a situation to punch a face, you just get a bonus. So it's really easy to make a build and then give yourself a trigger that then gives you a bonus to whatever primary thing your Lancer does in combat. And it lacks definition for what it cannot be used for, so players likely just always have a +2 to their primary skill or action, which is very abusable. The same goes for Daggerheart. A vague statement can be loosely applied to almost any situation. Silent as the Night, for instance, could be argued that it applies to roles where you're trying to deceive someone just because my character rarely talks, so my words should carry greater weight. This goes back to the whole good faith argument the book brings up at the very start, since players that aren't trying to be malicious or derail the campaign will argue until they're blue in the face that they should get a bonus from something for very loose reasons. If you've ever DM'd, I think you know what I'm talking about. Rule lawyers are argumentative players who 100% will try to abuse this mechanic. The only thing keeping it from being too abusable is that using experience costs a hope. So for costing a resource, the bonus from experience isn't even very good. Like I said before, changing it to advantage would be better for players to understand and track, but also to make it worth using. I foresee players trying to abuse this mechanic to apply +2 to almost all roles, or almost never using it because the DM rules that it doesn't apply to most situations. And I know my argument might sound a little contradictory because I'm saying it's bad because it's highly abusable, but it's also bad because it doesn't give you much of a bonus. The truth is that if you buff this feature just a little bit, like remove the requirement that it needs a hope to be used, or make it an advantage instead of +2, that alone would already make it far, far better. Next, you choose your level 1 domain cards. Domain cards are like class abilities or spells from D&D, but you choose from a small selection of domain cards instead. I like this because it gives players freedom in how they make their character and allows them to pick what they want. It's just disappointing how small the selection is per domain, and you choose a card from 2 different domains, which helps, but it is still a relatively limited selection. Connections are purely for roleplay and give no mechanical advantage. They are just some questions that you and other players can fill out to define your connection with their PCs. That's fine, I appreciate it's there since campaigns run more smoothly when PCs already know each other to some degree at the very beginning. But I guess I can use this as an opportunity to talk about how I handled connections in Mythic. In Mythic, it's called affiliations, and if you choose to have your character know another player's character, having an affiliation with them, it'll grant your character a further origin point. You can know up to 2 other PCs in the group, allotting you 2 additional origin points. Origin points in Mythic can be spent on skills to give them an additional +1 to that skill. I like this better because it mechanically encourages players to integrate knowing other PCs into the game. There's also a section on the Mythic character sheet where you write down which player/PC you know, and the reason why you know them. I just think in games that are so mechanically driven, giving players a mechanical incentive to know other players is a good way to handle it, rather than it just being player-led roleplay. It's that too, but both of them together. And that's how you make a character. I made a lot of tangents as I went, but if you want a non-tangent filled version, go and watch the Critical Role's video tutorial on how to make a character in Daggerheart on their channel. So not including my critiques about the game's design that didn't really relate to the character creation, I think the character creation is a relatively painless process that won't take anyone too long to do. But one thing I will complain about is that in this book, it goes through a detailed step-by-step on how to make a character, but then the actual useful information on adding stuff to your sheet is 13 pages away from where the character creation section actually starts. So the section that is supposed to be a brief checklist for making a character so that a veteran player can quickly look at it and remember all the stuff they need to do to make a character is 13 pages long, with some descriptions appearing nowhere else in the character creation section. So you have to read the checklist section every time, but if you want detailed information on a class, for instance, you'll need to jump several pages to begin looking at detailed info on a class. They really should have kept the checklist for character creation just that. A very brief checklist that at most is a page long that is mostly used for reference on making a new character. But instead the checklist has very important info inside of it, like how the standard array works and experiences work, that are not explained anywhere else. I think it's just a little bit of an inefficient layout. In Chapter 2 I'm skipping to the core mechanics because everything before it is common TTRPG knowledge and stuff covered by other games as well. Going to Spotlight/Initiative. So the Spotlight isn't anything new in TTRPGs. When it comes to a player's turn initiative in D&D, or when a player performs an action out of combat that needs resolving, there was always a form of Spotlight. It was just never named as such. So the more interesting thing about Spotlight is how initiative in combat works. Instead of having players and NPCs roll dex checks and assemble a list of those checks in descending order to figure out who goes when in combat, instead it is left up to the players to decide how much they want to do before letting someone else take a turn. Turns in Daggerheart are called player moves. So I really don't like this. I am the type of player who usually keeps my mouth shut during sessions and lets myself be more of a background character. I like experiencing the overall story of the campaign and making a cool build. I'm not really interested in engaging in moment-to-moment drama. I'm pretty introverted, and I tend to let others start or lead in situations. So in a system like this, I feel like I would be at a huge disadvantage because the system highly incentivizes loud and extroverted players to take control and take their turn as soon as they talk over everyone else. And according to the rules, there is no mechanic to limit how much one player can do on their turn that they yelled over everyone else to get to first. So theoretically, a loud player who demands to go first rolls a ton of stuff on his turn, and on his fifth action, he makes a roll and rolls with fear. And when you roll with fear in initiative in Daggerheart, initiative flips to the enemies. So if you aren't keeping track of who took turns before it flipped to the enemies, players will likely forget and start yelling to take actions again once initiative goes back to players. Then there's this one line trying to justify the no initiative order. Quote, "If they aren't mechanically locked into combat, players might find it easier to choose a solution, such as having their character flee from their opponents or come to a temporary truce with their enemies." Unquote. Any half-decent DM would allow players several opportunities to talk with people they are about to fight before the fight begins, unless the DM wants it to be an ambush. Having no initiative order doesn't magically make it easier for players to ask the people they are fighting to please stop. I have DM situations where players convince enemies to stand down during combat. It's not impossible. No initiative might make it a little easier since you don't have to wait for it to get to your or the enemy's turn to have a conversation, but you can also just DM it, so if a player is using their action to talk to the enemies, they can just have a brief back and forth before the player's turn ends. And in my experience, once combat starts, players turn into murderous psychopaths who just want to tear the enemies limb from limb. They're not interested in talking anymore. So the GM move section is interesting. I'll put it up on screen. Based on how it's written, it seems like it's not just limited to combat. It looks more like it's based on how players roll. So if a player fails to roll or rolls with fear, some sort of escalation occurs. But there's kind of a problem because you can pass a roll with fear, meaning that the DM gets a fear to spend how they like and make the scene you're in have an escalation. As described by the section, quote, "GM moves escalate the scene in an exciting and dangerous way. A new threat might emerge from the woods. The PCs could be separated by a sudden cave-in, or another similar action may significantly change the scene. These all sound like the outcomes of failed rolls, and yet they can occur on a roll that is a success but with fear. That doesn't really sound fair or fun. For instance, let's say a rogue is sneaking around an enemy base, and they rolled a stealth check to sneak by some guards. They succeed in their stealth check by rolling higher than the guard's passive perception, but they roll with fear. So what is the escalation? Is the player still spotted because they rolled with fear, or does the DC just go up the next time they roll a stealth check? I mean, the text literally says, quote, "GM moves can happen in nearly any time, but they most commonly occur when a PC rolls with fear or fails an action roll," unquote, which makes no distinction between failing a roll and succeeding at a roll, but with fear. I also find it odd that the book is trying to turn logical reactions to failed checks into mechanics like GM moves. Using the previous example, if a rogue failed their stealth check and the guard notices them, then the logical sequence of events is for the guards to want to try to either kill or capture the PC, right? This already works in D&D. Maybe not what this specific framework Daggerheart has, but it does. So in D&D, if the rogue is caught, I as the GM would then say, "The guards brandish their weapons and demand for you to freeze and surrender to them. What do you do?" Like, any half-decent DM knows that you should be constantly prompting your players. Do you really need to apply this game's initiative system to these types of situations? And it really makes me wonder for a moment, if the game's initiative system was designed around situations like these instead of combat, since these out-of-combat skill challenges require a lot of back and forth between DM and player. The game's intro says it's all about the narrative over everything else, and initiative-based situations benefit from this initiative system, but it's an initiative that doesn't really need to exist since D&D and other TTRPGs already ran like this without this specific framework. The section gave me a page number for how fear is spent by the GM as GM moves, so I jumped to that section. I found this little table listing all the ways GM moves can be used. As I said, this is stuff any DM or GM that has ever played D&D for a significant amount of time would do in reaction to failed rolls. I mean, it's nice for new GMs to see this stuff and be made aware of how you can make failing have significant impact to players and their stories. I just find it kind of odd that Daggerheart is making it a rigid system. Whether it's mechanic or not, stuff like this must occur in the game or it will get really bland and boring since there will be no failure states. And it continues to not make any distinction between a failed roll and a successful one but rolled with fear. The players have two different ways that they can fail at whatever they're trying to do. A GM can have a maximum of 12 fear and gains fear every time a player rolls with fear. The pool of fear GMs have is recommended to be visible to players at all times. I guess that's fine, but it can undermine tension because players can see how much fear GMs have at all times. Spending fear in combat is a little more limited, as shown on page 154 in this little list. I think they're all fine other than the most basic one that I think GMs might use the most often, being the interrupt the player. Thankfully, the description of this GM action is recommended to be done between player moves, which I assume is done because it would be really annoying to interrupt a player as they are rolling for things during their move. So here's the main mechanic of the game. Instead of rolling a 1d20 like in D&D or Pathfinder, you roll 2d12s called duality dice of preferably two different colors. One is your hope d12 and the other is your fear d12. When you roll and your hope die is higher, you gain a hope even if you fail. When you roll and your fear die is higher, the GM gains a fear even if you succeed. And as described previously, it's essentially a second way to fail a roll. When rolling your d12s, add up their numbers and add whatever modifiers to it to determine the overall number for a roll. When the hope and fear die land on the same number when rolling, it's a critical success, which apparently is twice as likely to happen as opposed to using a d20, according to what people say online. Not necessarily a bad thing, but might cheapen crits a bit. The biggest problem I can think of with this system is that it's just a lot of steps to go through every time you roll dice. For instance, every time you roll, you have to 1. Roll dice, 2. Check if you rolled fear or hope higher, 3. Inform the DM if you rolled with fear or hope, 4. Add your fear or hope die together, 5. Add the appropriate modifiers. While you could compact step 2 and 3 down into 1, that would still be 4 steps you have to go through. It's just a lot of steps to do for something you have to do so often in the game. In D&D, assuming you have all your modifiers pre-prepped, which you should have when making a character or after leveling up, all you have to do is roll 1d20 and add your modifiers to determine if you succeed in a roll. It's only 2 or 3 steps at most if you add your stat and modifiers separately. So Daggerheart's way of resolving basic rolls might become fatiguing quickly to some. You can gain a maximum of 6 hope at any one time. Gain any more and it doesn't do anything. You can spend a hope to help an ally, which is good that using the help action requires something more than just agreeing that you want to help a PC. In D&D, the help action requires nothing but an action to perform and bestows another PC or NPC advantage on their roll, any roll. This is generally bad to use in combat from one PC to another for action economy reasons, but having a familiar do it, or do it outside of combat and the initiative order, it's really busted since you just get advantage on whatever you want all the time. In my experience, DMs usually put some sort of homebrew restrictions to the help action, like needing proficiency in a skill to be able to give help to another PC who is using that skill. But in Daggerheart's case, it costs a hope. Using a hope to use an experience was talked about before. You can use 3 hope dice to initiate a tag team roll between you and one other PC. What does this mean exactly? I skipped to page 97 really quick to find out. Immediately, the description tells me that this can only be done once per session. Important info. So quick tangent, why are so many things in this rulebook brought up in one section and then explained in more detail on a later page? This isn't a unique occurrence, this has been happening all throughout the book. In some areas it's more justifiable, like something in the intro referencing something from chapter 2, but the using hope section? Tag team rules are brought up for the first time on page 91, but I have to jump to page 97 just to get a detailed explanation as to what it is and how it works. It's an inefficient layout design. Why not just explain it as it comes up? That's definitely what I'm trying to do in Mythic, and it's not always possible or easy to do, but it just makes a lot more sense to me rather than having to page hop a bunch to figure out how mechanics work in their entirety. Okay, tangent over. According to the tag team rules, quote, once per session, each player can choose to spend 3 hope and initiate a tag team roll between their character and another PC. When you do, work with the other character's player to describe how you combine your actions in a unique and exciting way. You both make separate action rolls, but before resolving the roll's outcome, choose one of the rolls to apply for both of your results. On a roll with hope, all PCs involved gain a hope. On a roll with fear, the GM gains a fear for each PC involved." End quote. This is kind of cool, but they could have pushed it farther. Since this can only be done once per session and it requires 6 hope to perform, 3 from each player, the actions of both PCs could guarantee a crit, or have greater effect, or double damage on top of essentially rolling with advantage like in D&D, rather than advantage in Daggerheart. But in its current form, I have to question how useful it would be. 3 hope from each player is a big ask, half their total hope pool, and can only be done once per session. The description then describes, quote, "Tag team rolls are especially powerful on attack rolls. When you and a partner succeed on a tag team roll attack, you both roll damage and add the totals together to determine the damage dealt. If the attacks deal different types of damage, physical or magical, you choose which type to deal." End quote. So one might read this and think 2 PCs are doubling their damage, but they're not. They will be doing the same amount of damage they would have been doing if they took their turns separately. It's just summed and you two decide what damage type it is. Kinda lame for everything tag team rules require. You can also spend hope to activate a hope feature. Domain cards come with abilities and can be activated with hope, and you'll need to refer to those to see how much hope they require and what they do. So, while I sound negative in some ways about hope, I really do like that the game has a central resource all builds utilize. Unlike D&D, where there are spell slots, superior die, key points, wild shape charges, and many more, it's a lot to keep track of, especially as the DM, making sure players are not purposely or accidentally breaking the rules. My issue with the hope system, and fear system, is that getting hope is entirely reliant on rolls. The only way to get hope is to roll with hope, and if you're having a bad night of rolling, you can enter combat encounters with little to no hope. The game is still playable without hope, as making basic attack actions can still be done, but using some domain abilities will be impossible to do without it. The same goes for fear with the DM. What if players just roll really well all night, and you don't have enough fear to make combat all that engaging? Or worse, you don't have enough fear to make a plot point happen, since you must spend fear to make combat or story important moments happen in the game. I have a system kinda like Hope in Mythic, but it functions more like spell slots where players start the day with a certain amount and use them throughout the in-game day until they are depleted. They are called ability slots, and every class has access to them and can use them for different things. D&D has spell slots, superior die, key, and many more versions of resources, but Mythic just has the one to reduce confusion and streamline the game. Especially since Mythic is a classless system, so unlike Hope in Daggerheart, I can generally know how much my players can do at any given moment because I don't have to rely on my players rolling well or poorly to determine how effective they will be in combat. The same goes for DM-controlled adversaries. Like, I really have to wonder if this game took so long to come out, despite how gutted and vague many of its rules can be, because it took forever to properly balance enemies, since it's always a crapshoot on whether players and enemies will have a decent amount of hope and fear to utilize. Okay, another quick tangent. I mentioned it before, but it's really annoying how much this book will bring up something, either explain it in detail or not, and then you will need to jump to another page to get a fuller and more complete understanding of that thing. In this case, it's rolling with fear. I talked about players rolling with fear before with the GM moves section, but then I find out on page 91 that it's brought up again and says something different than previously, where in the GM moves section there is no distinction made between failing a roll and rolling with fear. In the using fear section, it says that there actually is a difference. As a player, rolling with fear doesn't mean your action roll fails. Instead, you face a complication or consequence. For example, your character learns only some of the information they need, suffers a counterattack from the adversary they just struck, or encounters an unexpected danger or hazard. If you fail the action roll where you rolled with fear, those consequences or complications are worse. End quote. So rolling with fear is more of a degree of success, I guess. If you don't know, in Pathfinder, and Mythic a little, there are degrees of success where if you pass a roll far above the DC, then you get greater benefits from the roll, and you get even more benefits from rolling with a crit. The opposite is true for rolling low. I've never been a huge fan of this system because it's already kinda exists in D&D, it's just not a written rule. Like in D&D, technically you can only crit in combat, but almost every DM I've played with allows players to crit with any kind of roll, which allows them to get away with a lot through that crit roll. The opposite is true for Nat 1s. The issue being, just like in the GM move section, despite saying that something different is meant to happen between a failed roll and a success with fear, the outcome of both results is the same thing essentially. For instance, your party is meeting an NPC who has incriminating documents that could ruin the BBEG's social standing with the king. The unforeseen happens and the BBEG shows up at the same time as you to get the documents, so you cannot incriminate them. Let's say after a fight, you and the BBEG are in a photo finish to reach to grab the documents, and your GM is requiring you to make a roll to beat the BBEG and grab the documents for yourself first. Example 1. You roll with fear but succeed. The escalation is that the BBEG grabs half the documents, so you and your party can only partially incriminate the BBEG. Example 2. You fail your roll and the BBEG grabs all the documents and flees, leaving you and your party unable to incriminate the BBEG. Both examples essentially have the same outcome because for example 1 where the BBEG gets half the documents, the BBEG cannot be fully incriminated, and maybe he doesn't get arrested or killed by the king's guards. And in example 2, nothing happens to the BBEG and he is not arrested or killed by the king's guards, resulting in the PC needing to do something else to end the BBEG. Of course, your GM can rule it differently. Maybe half the documents is enough to get the BBEG jailed for a short amount of time, or it's enough to get the BBEG straight up killed. The issue being that degrees of success in this manner makes for messy storytelling. Since rolling with fear and failing, depending on the GM, means the same thing, then there are essentially just two ways of failing a roll in this game, which sucks. But also that makes how the story proceeds messy and hard to handle for the GM, as they constantly need to make shit up on the fly to accommodate successes with fear that could have large ramifications in the story, where binary success or failure can make the story play out in a far more simplified sequence of events that requires the GM to adapt less. Okay, so I'm actually pretty interested in this section since I have a self-made stress system in Mythic I made from scratch, so I'm super interested in seeing what Daggerheart did with their stress system. To start off, there is a section on the player's character sheet that looks a lot like your health that is used in a similar way, where when you take damage, you check off a health box. When you suffer stress, you check off a stress box. When all your stress boxes become checked and you're at maximum stress, you gain a condition in Daggerheart called Vulnerable, which means all rolls targeting you have advantage. You have this condition until you reduce your stress by at least 1. The consequences of maxing out stress is pretty boring, but I have to wonder if that's for the best. In my most recent playtest of Mythic, my players' main feedback was that there is too much in the game to track, so I really have to wonder if making the consequences of maxing out stress be something as basic as everything has advantage against you is the best way to handle it. It lacks randomness and nuance, but it's easy to understand. In Mythic, when you max out your stress, or in other words reach your stress threshold, you must make a will saving throw. No matter if you pass or fail, your stress is halved to represent your panic attack getting the stress out of your system, or stealing yourself as a way to reduce the stress. If you pass the save, nothing happens, but if you fail, you roll on the panic attack table. I really don't want to get rid of this table since it creates a lot of variable outcomes to having a panic attack, but I can't argue that how simple just being vulnerable is. So which do I prefer? Daggerheart's simplicity or Mythic's greater nuance, but also requiring more tracking? And keep in mind, just because I made Mythic doesn't mean I by default love all the systems I made in Mythic. It's still a work in progress, and I know the stress system in its current form will likely need more tweaking in the future. But yeah, I think I like my system more. It's kinda lame that the outcome of maxing out stress in Daggerheart equates to essentially being stunned in D&D. I mean, your PC can still move and act, but being stunned, as in every roll has advantage against you, and just makes it that much easier for enemies to kill you. In its odd sense, why put something in the game that makes PCs easier to kill, when Daggerheart's death mechanics essentially allow players to never die? I'll talk about death mechanics more later. Players can suffer stress from enemy abilities, which is a good idea and I should do that for Mythic. One of the issues with the stress system in my game currently is that it just doesn't come up much, and making it so enemies can have abilities that can make players suffer stress is a good idea. PCs can also suffer stress when the DM thinks they should, like after a tense conversation or a hard-fought battle. A similar thing is said in Mythic, the hard part being that it's hard to be specific about what things should induce stress to PCs. Some players play PCs that are supposed to be ultra badasses that are emotional stones, where other players play PCs that are crybabies, so it can be tough as a DM to tell players to take stress when the players think their character really shouldn't. That's why in Mythic, really the only situation where PCs suffer stress, no matter what, is when an ally in combat goes unconscious or dies. Because even if you're playing the emotional stone badass character, someone in your party just died, so your chances of surviving just dropped by a lot. It becomes a self-preservation thing at that point. Daggerheart also allows you to take stress willingly to perform some actions or abilities, but only once per roll. The issue of bringing things up and then telling you to jump to another page to learn more comes up again, so I jumped to page 107 to learn more. It says, essentially, what the previous paragraph already said, so it's super lame that willingly taking on stress doesn't do more. It's restricted to ability usage from domains. And I guess this is a good time to bring up an issue I've been noticing about Daggerheart since I first started picking it apart, and that it lacks universal abilities or actions. Universal abilities or actions are things that any PC or build can perform in combat. Things like making an attack with a weapon, grappling, shoving, attack of opportunities, all things any character can perform in D&D, but not in Daggerheart. I mean, only the warrior can make an attack of opportunity in this game, which is really weird. But that all is made worse with the stress system since it can't be used to enhance any kind of turn. In Mythic, there is a section called Beneficial Stress, which allows players to take on stress to enhance their turn. They can do this once per turn and allows them to add damage die to their damage rolls, take an extra action or reaction, and get a temporary ability slot. I think this is a far better way of handling beneficial stress since it allows anyone of any build to take advantage of it. Doing it this way, on top of stress activating some abilities in Daggerheart, would be the best setup. But of course, it would need to be heavily modified to better fit Daggerheart. I already talked about how duality die works and its strengths and weaknesses. Otherwise, action rolls work just like ability checks in D&D. Roll the base dice and add modifiers and additional dice to calculate the sum and see if it passes the difficulty rating. Example action rolls. Okay, so I complained about degrees of success and how succeeding with fear and failing a roll are not significantly differentiated earlier in the book. Finally, on page 95, 7 pages after the GM moves, and succeeding with fear is brought up, we are finally given a specific example of the difference between rolling and succeeding with fear and just failing a roll. Thank God. The failure with fear description is, quote, Alia rolls 3 on the hope die and 6 on the fear die, then adds 2 from her agility for a result of 11 with fear. 11 is below the roll's difficulty. So the GM gains fear, and because play passes back to the GM on a failure, they describe the mage taking an attack roll in response to Tabby's maneuver. The attack is successful, so the mage knocks Tabby off the parapet with a blast of magical fire and deals damage. Tabby crashes down to the ground below and must find a way back up if she plans to face the mage head on again. Unquote. The failure with hope description reads, quote, Alia rolls a 6 on her hope die and 3 on her fear die, then adds 2 more from her agility. That's 11 with hope. A total of 11 isn't enough to make it across safely, so in failure, the GM makes a move, narrating that the mage sees Tabby coming and makes an attack, which succeeds. The mage blast knocks Tabby off balance, leaving her dangling from the parapet. Her progress stalled and position precarious. Tabby gains a hope, but her friends are still in the line of fire and might need her help to reach safety. Unquote. The success with fear description reads, quote, Alia rolls a 5 on her hope die and a 9 on her fear die, then adds 2 from her agility. That's a 16 with fear. So it's a success. The GM gains fear and asks Alia to describe how she races across the parapet. After her description, the GM takes over, saying that once Tabby is crossed, she faces her foe head on, blocking them from attacking the rest of the party. But as a consequence for a result with fear, the mage reaches out with magic and crumbles the parapet behind Tabby, leaving her trapped and unable to move back to safety. At least the mage isn't attacking her friends, right? Unquote. The failure with fear example is surprisingly harsh for this game, as seems to focus on player empowerment and lacks combat. In this example, just for failing a check with fear, our character is hit by an enemy attack out of turn order, even for Daggerheart standards, which should only go to the enemy's move when the player's move is fully resolved, and they fall, taking fall damage, likely resulting in massive amounts of damage suffered. This sounds like the outcome from a Nat 1 in D&D, which is problematic because, despite not having any math to back up this claim, failing with fear is statistically far more likely than rolling a Nat 1 on a 1d20, which means critical failure situations can occur way too often. Critical failures are fun sometimes, but if they happen all the time, it gets old pretty fast. I know that from personal experience. If this situation was to occur in D&D, the harshest result that would happen is that the player would fall and take fall damage, because the enemy would not be able to act unless it's their turn, or as a reaction, or with a legendary action, which not all enemies have, of course. Or, if they have a nice DM, they can make another save to catch themselves to hang off the side of the parapet, which is what happens in the fail with hope situation. This is the only fail state that makes sense to me, at falling and crossing a narrow parapet, which sounds like a balancing action. But succeeding with fear, while thankfully and finally differentiated from failing with fear or hope, still feels like a hollow success since something bad still happens despite getting what you want. In the example, Tabby gets to the mage, but is cut off from retreat or presumably her friends. This makes for a more dramatic situation, but depending on the DM, could make for a really hollow success. The book mentions that you should not undermine success when it comes to success with fear. That is a pretty thin line, and honestly, I'd rather just deal with binary success or failure, since they're faster and puts less on the DM to make up stuff, and thus prevents the DM from getting blamed when a character is knocked out of a fight or killed. I don't have too much to say about this section. I just find it funny that it's called as such because all the types of rolls described are rolls you would be making on a regular basis. There's nothing special or uncommon about them. One thing I do want to talk about is the group action rolls, because just like the duality die, this change needlessly complicates the process. In D&D, when making a group check, everybody makes the same check. If half the party or more succeeds, the group succeeds. If less than half the party succeeds, then the group fails. The process of group checks in D&D goes as follows. 1. Everyone rolls the same check. 2. Everyone reports what they rolled. 3. The DM determines if at least half the party succeeds and if the group succeeds overall. Let's compare it to Daggerheart, which requires 1. Players decide who leads the group in this check. Everyone rolls the same check. For players who are not leading, they roll a reaction roll. Reaction rolls are fully explained on a later page. Gross. But essentially you cannot roll hope or fear on a reaction roll and no one can help you on it. 3. Determine how many players succeed or fail, and tally up the +1s and -1s, so the leader rolls last, I guess? Not really explained. Have the leader of the group action roll and add all penalties or buffs from what player's reaction rolled. 5. The DM determines if the party succeeds or fails. It's a situation just like the armor and health system. A system from D&D is taken and made needlessly more complicated, adding more steps to it for a reason I cannot think of. Like, how is this improving the experience of playing the game? It just slows the game down. What's worse is that this section and the reaction roll section contradict each other. The group action roll stated that, quote, they, the players, can use different traits for their reaction rolls if they wish, end quote. And the reaction roll section stating, quote, when you make a reaction roll, the GM tells you what trait to use, unquote. So is this section contradicting itself? Or is this a situation where group checks are the one exception to how reaction rolls work? Which is confusing. Damage rolls. Daggerheart wants his cake and wants to eat it too. I've already talked about Daggerheart's weird DT system earlier, but it kinda comes back up here. It's obvious to me that the makers of this game wanted to maintain the fun of rolling a bunch of dice to determine damage when hitting an enemy, but like I described before, it's inefficient, slow, and contrary to the main goal of Daggerheart, being a more rules-light system. Otherwise, rolling for damage works a lot like how it does in D&D. There are only 2 types of damages in Daggerheart, physical and magic. I like this to a degree, since the many damage types in D&D can be hard to keep track of. The only downside is that it's harder to make enemies who are resistant or immune to some types of damage. Though, damage resistance or immunity rarely comes up in low to mid-level play in D&D, so I don't think it's a big deal either way. Resistances and immunities work exactly as they do in D&D. Advantage and disadvantage work pretty much like how it does in D&D, but instead of rolling an extra d20, you add or subtract a d6 to your roll. I remember reading a long time ago that advantage mathematically means essentially a +5 to your roll, so making a d6 drastically reduces the influence of advantage or disadvantage effects circumstances, since on average it will give your roll a +3 or -3. I don't think there is necessarily anything wrong with that, but I do like how Daggerheart allows for multiple advantages and disadvantages to cancel each other out to find out the overall advantage. For example, if you have 2 sources of advantage and 1 source of disadvantage, then one of the advantages and disadvantages cancel each other out, so you would have 1 advantage left over and you would be able to roll an advantage die for your next roll. In D&D, it states that having multiple advantages or disadvantages don't interact in interesting ways, they just cancel out. So if you have 5 things giving you advantage in D&D and just 1 thing giving you disadvantage, you have neither advantage or disadvantage. So one completely cancels out the opposite no matter how numerous. I fucking hate that, to be honest. It's such a boring way to handle an otherwise interesting situation, and de-incentivizes players from considering all possible options to get advantage and get rid of disadvantage for a roll. Daggerheart instead opts for a 1-to-1 cancellation, which is far better, but still only allows 1d6 to be rolled for either advantage or disadvantage. In Mythic, if you were wondering, advantage and disadvantage actually works more like Daggerheart's version, but instead of only allowing players to roll 1d6 for advantage or disadvantage, players can roll as many as the situation calls for. So if a player has advantage from 3 different sources, they roll 3d6 and add it to their roll. The same goes for disadvantage. Advantage and disadvantage cancels out on a 1-to-1 basis, so if a player has 3 advantages and 1 disadvantage, they roll 2d6 to represent the 2 advantage they have overall. And your first thought might be, isn't that overpowered? So far with a couple of small playtests and 1 full playtest I've done, it hasn't been. It also encourages players to really learn the game and to figure out all the common ways to get advantage, since it all can be stacked, making for a more engaging system. The only downside being that it can sometimes take a minute for players to figure out how many advantages and disadvantages they have overall, but it's usually not a lengthy process since getting more than one or two advantage is pretty uncommon so far, though high level gameplay is yet to be tested. So conditions are like damage types earlier. There are only 3 conditions in the game, which are hidden, restrained, and vulnerable. I talked about vulnerable earlier. Restrained works pretty much like how it does in D&D. Hidden is a little different since all rolls have disadvantage against you while you have this condition, as opposed to D&D where creatures simply don't have line of sight on you. The most interesting part about conditions is their lengths. A condition that is marked as temporary means that it can be essentially ended as soon as you get it. You just have to pass a check that is determined by the DM. I'm not a fan of this because it removes the mechanical roleplay from the game. I feel like in more recent years, people have ignored or forgotten that roleplay in D&D is not just speaking in character with a stupid voice and having an in-character table drama. Roleplay in D&D is also personified by the ability of crafted. Wizards focus intelligence skills, so they have crap athletics and acrobatics and can't escape grapples easily. Their builds, strengths, and weaknesses are personified in being good at casting powerful spells, but being able to do fuck all in melee. It mechanically and naturally has character-filling roles in a party, roles that might not be filled if PCs could pass whatever check with whatever skill. Despite my going on for a second, I don't think Daggerheart does this too much, but it is definitely a weakness of this game, even if it is small. And to get back on track, conditions seem pointless, since as soon as it gets to your spotlight, you can just get rid of it. Sure, it takes your action economy to do so, but players have endless actions so long as they don't roll with fear. Not to mention that only one of 2 conditions in this game makes all rolls made against you have advantage. So I don't know why you wouldn't use your action economy to get rid of that condition right away. The same goes for enemies, and through watching Age of Umbra, enemies seem to rarely not have at least a few fears, so they can use their spotlight to clear a condition, then use fear to get another spotlight. Domain cards. Your active domain cards grant you special abilities or spells. Unless a domain card states otherwise, you can use it as many times as you wish, for as long as it remains in your loadout. You can have a maximum of 5 active domain cards in your loadout at any one time. Your subclass, ancestry, and community cards don't count towards that limit and are always active. If you don't know, D&D has a system like this called preparing spells. I don't like that system because there's already a system in the game that limits how many spells you can cast in a day, which is the spell slot system. The point of the preparation system is to restrict players from having the exact spell they need as they need it in every situation. The problem with it is that the spell slot system already restricts players from having whatever spell they need at the moment whenever they need it, because if you play 5e in the way it's intended to be balanced, then you should be having several fights throughout an in-game day, which steadily uses up casters' spell slots throughout the in-game day. So by the time you get to the end of the dungeon or get to the BBEG, the spellcaster should have limited number of spell slots remaining, thus be very cautious on what they use those spell slots on, even if they can use it for whatever they need as they need it. For instance, it's close to the end of the in-game day, and the wizard in the party has been coveting their high-level spell slots for the end dungeon fight. There is a locked door and the rogue is unconscious. The wizard could cast Knock and unlock it with ease, but it would waste a 3rd level spell slot the wizard could use to cast Fireball the next fight. So the preparation system is redundant and overly restrictive in D&D and only serves to make the game less fun to play, along with being more complicated to play because figuring out as a caster how many spells you can have prepared at any one time can be a headache to figure out. So I'm surprised that Daggerheart has decided to include a system like it, especially when they're trying to make the game more streamlined and easy to understand as possible. According to the swapping cards section, you can still access cards that are in your vault. Your vault being the cards you have that you cannot use at the moment. Every domain card has a recall cost, which is the amount of stress you suffer when taking that card out of your vault and using it without taking a rest. It's nice that they included a system in this game that still lets you access domain cards you don't currently have equipped, unlike in D&D, where if you don't have a spell prepared, you just can't use the spell at all until resting. But it's still annoying that a system like this exists in Daggerheart because it's not even good in D&D. Overall, I still like domain cards because they are kind of like feats in D&D or perks from Fallout. They're abilities you get when leveling up that modify the way you play, especially for more martial focused classes. For instance, in the Blade domain you can get Not Good Enough, which allows you to re-roll 1s and 2s for your damage die. Or in the Bone domain, you can get the Rapid Riposte, which allows you to damage enemies that fail to hit you in a melee range at the cost of a stress. For caster classes, domain cards are just spells. I also really like that they come in card form, so they're really easy to track and you don't need to constantly refer to the book to know what they do. I just wish there was more of them. Currently in the game, there are only 2 domain cards per level per domain, which is a very limited amount. Being able to choose from 2 different domains helps, but it's still a very limited amount of options. I really wish instead of reinventing a lot of systems in this game to try to differentiate itself from D&D 5e, they really focused on the domain card system instead. Daggerheart has gone with a method of using measurements like inches on a ruler as a way of measuring range in-game while using maps. I'm not a fan of this. I prefer the usual grid or hexagon-based maps because they are easier to understand at a glance. With the normal grid, you can see all the squares right around your character for your threatened area, so if enemy is in there, you know they're in your threatened area and you can just make an attack of opportunity if they move away. But you don't have that in a system that uses actual measurements like from a ruler or a tape measure. I don't know about anyone else, but for me I have a really hard time judging the amount of inches between things just based off of sight, and so that makes the game slower and more annoying for me as a player, since I have to wait until my turn to reach over and measure several distances with a ruler before I feel confident in doing anything. I mean, theoretically I could do it on someone else's turn as well, but I don't want to interrupt other people's turns, so the most polite thing might be just to wait until my turn. Another issue I have with Daggerheart's ranges is how they're named. They are named melee, very close, close, far, very far, and out of range. But like, what's the difference between melee and very close? The description reads that melee is close enough that you can touch the creature, and very close is 5 to 10 feet away. But typically, at least in D&D, 5 feet is melee. Then you have close, which is defined as 10 to 30 feet away. So why call it close and confuse a player or potentially confuse the player when you could just call it specific ranges? I have definitely DM'd players in the past who pretty much completely forget the rules in between sessions, and I have to do my best to give them a crash course every session on the basics of the game. And it can get potentially really confusing if the ranges are named after commonly used words. At the same time, why not use specific measurements in each one's description, like 5 to 10 feet or 10 to 30 feet, for more specific and easier to understand communication? Players can argue about the definition of what close means because it means something a little different to everybody. But in game terms, it actually has a specific meaning, so it can get confusing really easily. I think they named ranges this way because they're trying to make Daggerheart, like they say at the beginning of the book, more friendly to narrative play, which means rules light. Or at least to me, it means rules light. They give ranges names that are easy to understand and make more sense for a theater of mind combat. I prefer maps with specific ranges since you can't argue about the definition of measurements of length. 5 feet is 5 feet. You can't argue that it's something else. But even worse, when you look at the definitions of these ranges, they don't give you one definitive range, they give you a range of ranges. The close description reads, quote, "Your character is close enough to a target to see their prominent details, such as across a room or in a neighboring market stall that is about 10 to 30 feet away," unquote. So even if you're playing a campaign that uses battle maps, you still don't know the specific range of different ranges because they're all ranges. For instance, imagine the range of Eldritch Blast in D&D having a range of 50 to 100 feet. Why bother giving a range when all I need to know is the limit of how far I can shoot Eldritch Blast? Like, is this game trying to tell me that there is a minimum range to these ranges? If so, it's not mentioned in their descriptions, so it's just confusing. Fortunately, the very next section called Using Range says that, quote, "Unless otherwise noted, an effect can also be used at closer ranges," unquote. But again, why not just tell me maximum range and then tell me it can also hit anybody closer than that range as well? Just odd. In Daggerheart, when you have the spotlight, or in other words, when it's your turn, you can take an action, which is an action, plus you move a distance equal to close range, which, as we established in the last section, just means a maximum of 30 feet. But if you want to move further in a single player move, you have to use your action on top of your normal movement and make an agility check. I don't really have anything positive or negative to say about this, it's really just a byproduct of the game's weird initiative and action system. In the gold section it says something interesting, quote, "There are no set prices in this book for weapons, armor, and loot, so you aren't locked out of adding exciting equipment if you're not playing a gold-focused campaign," unquote, which means GMs have to make up the prices for all items in the game. That can potentially be problematic, because first of all, that requires GMs to put prices on everything, and newer GMs might not have the experience to make certain items more expensive than others, and allow players to do some pretty game-breaking stuff. But that also makes preparing for sessions even more annoying, since GMs have to give the inventory of vendor prices. And vendor inventories can be large enough that assigning prices to all the items can become an annoying time sink. I know this from personal experience. The second interesting thing about gold in Daggerheart is that it's not tracked as numbers. Rather, it's tracked in abstract named amounts, kind of like how ranges work, where, quote, "Gold is measured in handfuls, bags, and chests, while 10 handfuls to 1 bag and 10 bags to 1 chest," unquote. So just like ranges, I think the makers of this game are trying to make keeping track of your money easier by abstracting it, but I think the makers of Daggerheart really overestimate the difficulty players have with tracking one number even if it gets up into the 5 digits or more. where now you have essentially a punch card on your character sheet that you fill up until it's full, and then it fills up one of the tiers of gold higher until you have one full chest worth. It's just way more efficient and easy to understand when on your character sheet you have a little box that you just put a single number in, and whenever you get more money or spend some money, you just add or deduct some gold from that number. It's not hard to figure out or keep track of. Let's say, for example, you spend one handful worth of gold, but you only have one bag worth of gold on you. Well, now you have 9 handfuls that you need to mark on your character sheet and get rid of that one bag of gold you had, and all of a sudden, the system that is trying to streamline keeping track of gold is now making the process more annoying than it was before. When it comes to resources like spell slots, superiority die, and key points, they can be a lot to track if you're multi-classing, but gold is just gold, a single number. It is nice that there seems to only be gold in this game, unlike D&D, which has copper, silver, gold, and even fucking electrum. No one ever uses that shit. So it's nice that they streamlined keeping track of money by just making it one number to track, but how that resource is being tracked is kind of nonsensical. Not to mention that this system is also trying to replace D&D's weight system when it comes to gold, where in classic D&D, and I think 5e, gold does weigh stuff, not weightless. Instead of having players keep track of the weight of gold in Daggerheart, they instead use abstract designations of gold of a chest to be the maximum amount of gold a PC can carry at one time. Most DMs solve the issue of tracking gold weight by just having players not keep track of it. Keeping track of the weight of gold is unfun and annoying, and it kind of ruins the power fantasy, so most DMs just don't have players track it. But Daggerheart is now including a new way for tracking gold weight without actually tracking gold weight, but you still have to limit how much gold you can carry at one time, which is kind of annoying. I do something similar in Mythic, not the gold weight thing, but having currency just be one thing. Since it's a sci-fi game, of course money in Mythic is just the credit that represents all digital currencies. None of it weighs anything in-universe, and in-game mechanics doesn't weigh anything because it's all digital. I think that's a much better way of handling money. So for death in this game, there are 3 options you can take when your hit points drop to 0. You can go out in a blaze of glory, which allows you to take an action that automatically critically succeeds, but your character dies right after. Then there's risk it all, where you roll your duality die, and if your hope die is higher, your character stays alive and clear a number of hit points and stress equal to the value of the hope die you rolled, but you also have to divide up what you rolled for hope between your health and stress points. If the fear die is higher, your character just dies. I like these 2 options because of their potential to heavily impact the narrative of the game mechanically. So it's cool that players, even in death, can turn the tide of combat by auto-succeeding in a crazy roll or rolling hope on risk it all, preventing the party from losing a member mid-combat. The one option for death that I find to be problematic is the avoid death option, which reads, quote, "Your character avoids death and faces the consequences. They temporarily drop unconscious, and then you work with the GM to describe how the situation worsens. Your characters can't move or act while unconscious. They can't be targeted by an attack, and they return to consciousness when an ally clears one or more of their marked hit points, or when the party finishes a long rest. After your character falls unconscious, roll your hope die. If this value is equal to or under your character's level, they gain a scar. Scars are explained immediately after, thankfully, where a scar means you mark off a hope slot that you can no longer use, so your maximum of 6 hope slots is reduced by 1. This compounds every time you take a scar. So my problem with this system is that players can use it to never die, and I think that's really lame. One of the big consequences of engaging in tactical combat and playing smart is that if you don't do that and make a lot of mistakes, or you're in a situation where the odds are just really stacked against you and you choose not to run, you die. Which makes the game feel more real and not just like it's a power fantasy, even though it is definitely a power fantasy. But it gets worse with avoid death option since it says that after your character falls unconscious, roll your hope die. If this value is equal to or under your character's level, they gain a scar. But the scar feature isn't even a guaranteed consequence. I find this really shallow because it gets rid of the drama and mechanical setback of losing a PC in combat. Sure, even if PCs are killed, but take the avoid death option, they are unconscious until getting at least 1 hit point back, which is easy to do with healing spells. Not to mention, the scar section explains that scars can actually be removed. They're not permanent. GMs come up with ways for players to remove them as downtime activities. I don't like that because if scars were permanent, the avoid death feature would have more weight to it, because that means everyone who takes that death option to keep playing their character still has a consequence. Their character will be even more vulnerable to dying going forward without an entire hope slot to use, which might incentivize players to retire the character at some point instead of playing them until they die. But since it's not guaranteed that you'll get a scar if you take the option, and you can remove the scars, it's very easy to have a character just go on forever without long-term consequences. I also think that a scar marking off a hope slot is a little harsh, since hope is essentially the game's equivalent to spell slots. Imagine if in D&D that anytime you went unconscious and woke up after getting healed, there was a chance you no longer had access to an entire level of spell slots. I think it would have been better if instead of marking off hope slots, you mark off stress slots as permanently being filled. That way your character still becomes more vulnerable over time until, the slightest amount of stress will cause them to max out stress and gain the condition of vulnerable. This way the character becomes more fragile over time, without essentially kneecapping the character's overall effectiveness and disallow them from performing some of their most powerful abilities. Earlier in the book it talked about situations where players did something really stupid, like jumping into a pool of lava. You, the GM, could just have them instantly die. But according to these rules, technically speaking, the player could just take a scar and not die, or the chance to take a scar and not die. Looks like there's also a resurrection section, but like a lot of other things in this game, it's pretty vague and lacks clear details on what players need to do to perform it. It's kind of just another situation where it's telling the GM to just figure it out, which is annoying. But there's also a spell in the game that just lets you resurrect people, and the spell description reads that it can resurrect anyone that died within the last 100 years. Which is a pretty big window of resurrection. It's a pretty high level spell though. Another thing I noticed in the death section is that this game lacks death saving throws. In D&D, when you drop to 0 hit points, your character falls unconscious and you make death saving throws, which are just straight d20 rolls. Roll higher than 10 and you succeed, lower than 10 and you fail, and if you fail 3 times you die. It's interesting that they don't have it in this game because death saving throws are a nice buffer in the game of D&D to prevent players from just instantly dying when they drop to 0 hit points. It's replaced by the death options in this game, and I'm not sure they're better than the death saving throw system. While the death saving throw system can be kind of boring because just making one roll and then it immediately goes to the next person's turn. But it can also be really tense because your rolls are determining whether your PC literally lives or dies. So it can be some of the most tense rolls you can make in the game. One reason why they might have steered away from the death saving throw system is because they were trying to stop players from, I don't know what it's called, but there's this tactic in D&D where if the initiative order supports it, you can have players essentially be on death's door constantly. A player could have sub 10 health, and then whenever it gets to the enemy's turn, they get knocked unconscious from dropping to 0 hit points and start making death saving throws. Then the cleric's turn is next, and they just heal them for the minimum amount of health and get them back up, so when it gets to their turn, they can just do a bunch of damage to the enemies. And then once their turn ends, and the initiative gets back to the enemies, they can knock them unconscious again. It's a very cheesy way of playing D&D, and I honestly support trying to find ways to at least incentivize players to not do it. Daggerheart sort of got rid of it, but also didn't, since the avoiding death options work just like how losing consciousness in D&D does, and a down player needs only 1 HP restored to get back up. Of course, the scar system is a failsafe in that situation, since doing this several times can cause a PC to collect several scars. But since gaining a scar isn't guaranteed, it can still be done with potentially few consequences. Another reason as to why they should probably just remove the avoid death option. Other ways games have handled the low health cheesy tactic is like in Baldur's Gate 3. Whenever you get a PC up from being unconscious in combat, they just don't get an action when it comes to their turn. They get a bonus action and movement, but they don't get anything else. Problem with this is that when players get up from being unconscious, even if you're not using that cheesy near-death tactic, your PC is now a sitting duck in combat because they can't fucking do anything. All they can do is bonus action chug a healing potion and run away to cover, which sucks and ruins the power fantasy. In Mythic, I handle it so if players do stuff like this, it procs the stress system. In Mythic, every time a player goes unconscious in combat, everybody in the party suffers 1 stress, and the person who went unconscious suffers 2. So you're not permanently losing health or the ability to use special actions. It's more like every time you do this, your character becomes a little more panicked. This way players are not barred from doing everything they normally could, but still risking becoming a liability in combat. Not saying this is the best way of doing it, it's just one way. When hitting certain milestones in Daggerheart, you will level up. Daggerheart does not explain what milestones are. A milestone is a predetermined point in a campaign narrative where something of import has occurred, like killing the BBEG or accomplishing the goal of a quest. For such a narrative-focused game that does not have an XP system, I'm surprised they do not explain that, especially since Daggerheart goes into extensive detail on how players and GM's interactions are meant to play out in earlier sections. Daggerheart doesn't have an XP system. As a GM that never uses the XP system in D&D, I completely understand this decision, especially since Daggerheart is meant to be a narrative-first game that is less reliant on systems pushing the story forward. This way, big story moments can feel even more impactful when players also level up. The overview section details that there are only 10 levels in Daggerheart. I like this since, in D&D, if you do not multi-class, there are a few levels between 1 and 20 where you gain very little. No new spell slots, no new features, nothing. just a bump in health. I think that having only 10 levels helps not only condense the leveling experience to make sure players feel like they're gaining tangible boosts in power every level up, but also condenses the narrative of your campaign, resulting in players reaching their maximum potential sooner, ending the campaign sooner, since campaigns tend to end not long after reaching the highest level. I know there's a lot of people out there who like playing campaigns that last for multiple years, but I don't. I prefer trying out different characters more often without needing to have my character die or leave the campaign. I also prefer trying out different settings more often, or slightly changing a setting more often, like having the new campaign take place like 100 years after the end of the last one. Having fewer levels in the game to encourage shorter campaigns is a great idea. Next are the tiers of play that explain how players not only have levels, but their levels are subsections of a tier. Tier 1 encompasses level 1 only. Tier 2 encompasses levels 2, 3, and 4. Tier 3 encompasses levels 5, 6, and 7. Tier 4 encompasses levels 8, 9, and 10. Each tier other than the first encompasses 3 levels. Your tier affects your damage threshold, level achievements, and more. Tiers seem to be Daggerheart's version of ability score improvements, ABIs. Where in D&D, assuming you are not multiclassing, every 4th level up, level 4, 8, 12, etc., your character gets an ABI to raise one ability score by 2 or 2 ability scores by 1, or forgo an ABI to get a feat instead. Every time you level up in Daggerheart, you get 2 advancement options from your current tier or lower. These advancement options are essentially points that you can allot to certain bonuses within the tier list of bonuses by checking a box. You cannot fill out a bonus if there are no more boxes left to check. I'm split about this setup because it does something kind of similar to Mythic, where you get points on a level up to allot to different skills. It's a good way to give players more choices to make as they level up, unlike in D&D, where when you level up, other than ABIs and which subclasses you choose, you don't get to choose much of anything for most levels. You get more health and class features, sometimes a subclass feature. That's it. No more choice making. I think that is why multiclassing is so popular. It gives players more choices to make, and thus more agency when making a character build. That and multiclassing builds tend to be very busted. My issue with Daggerheart's advancement options is that there are things that are far easier to improve and increase in D&D. You know, they took a basic level up feature of D&D and made it a level up tree essentially. And I fucking hate level up trees, because more often than not, they do exactly this. Pick abilities and features that really should be basic conclusions to the game and lock them behind arbitrary level ups. Increasing health, stress, and evasion are all things that require advancement options investment. Where in D&D, when you level up, you just get more health. Increasing AC is done by getting different armor or ABIs. Getting new class features is something you just get without requiring any kind of investment, other than sticking to your one class. To be fair, every level up you do get a new domain card of your level or lower, no matter what, and you can use advancement options to get additional ones. But still, increasing your traits, health, stress, evasion, and proficiency are such no-brainer choices. Why would you ever spend points on anything else? You know, it's kind of like an illusion of choice. So I went ahead and leveled up my human warrior test character from 1 to 10 just to see how this went. Despite not liking how the tier system works, leveling up is incredibly simple in this game and likely can be done in just a few minutes per level by most classes. Notably faster than how it works in D&D, especially for caster classes that can get a little complicated. Keeping track of how many spells you should know based on stat and level. Don't even get me started on the equation figuring out how many spells you're allowed to have prepared for a wizard. That being said, part of the reason why leveling up in Daggerheart is so easy and quick to perform is because so many nuances, choices, and differences between classes have been stripped out of the game compared to D&D. If you look at the tier list and what you can put advancement options into, you might notice that no matter what class it is, the tier list is the same for all of them. So all the front-loaded features you get at level 1 really are the only things that will differentiate your characters from one another for the entire rest of the game. Of course, you can get new domain cards and can multi-class and enhance your subclass, but still, most advancement options are just improving basic features to a character. Traits, health, stress, evasion, proficiency. It's really boring. And with multiclassing being the better choice over improving your subclass in this game, the role you play in this role-playing game can be further diluted to the point that your one character can have overlapping skills and expertise with several others. This game fails to tangibly differentiate the classes and builds players can make post-level 1. In D&D, when you take a few level dips in a class, you do not suddenly become almost as capable in that class as another player who has been only that class for the entire campaign. For instance, let's say there are 2 level 10 characters. One is a sorcerer named Anna, the other is a warlock named Joe. Joe decided to take a 3 levels in sorcerer for sorcery points for a multi-class. There is no way that Joe, a 7th level warlock with 3 levels of sorcerer, is going to be as effective as Anna, who has been a sorcerer for the entire campaign. Anna will have far more sorcery points and more spell slots compared to Joe, along with many more features in sorcery. Unlike in Daggerheart, where most class features are gained at level 1, If Joe multiclasses into being a sorcerer, he immediately has access to most of the same features Anna has, the only difference being the amount of domain cards Anna has in her domain, resulting in build identities getting muddied really fast, which also speaks to the point I made previously in the video, that the mechanics of the game are just as important for role-playing as characters acting with dumb voices in scenes. If Joe can suddenly become almost as competent as Anna in being a sorcerer just through multiclassing, then what's the point of having different classes? Another negative I noticed while leveling is that subclasses can only be upgraded by taking subclass upgrades through the advancement options. In D&D, when hitting certain levels, you just gain new features or abilities from your subclass. But in Daggerheart, you have to spend the resources to specifically get it. Not a ton, you get 6 advancement option points per tier, 2 per level, and upgrading your subclass only costs 1, so it's not a gigantic investment or anything. I just think that it undermines how useful subclasses can be, since you need to go out of your way in this game to prioritize upgrading your subclass. Upgrading traits, health, stress, evasion, and proficiency are far more of a priority because all those upgrades directly increase your character's survivability and effectiveness in and out of combat. Subclass features are nice and can be helpful, but tend not to be as directly beneficial as upgrading traits, health, stress, evasion, and proficiency. I think players just getting access to subclasses higher levels when achieving new tiers rather than needing to spend resources to get it. That way players can continue to make their class stand out from others of the same class and spend that tier upgrade somewhere else arguably more useful. Multiclassing makes the subclass issue even worse. When I was going over the classes earlier in the video, I was positive towards the fact that you get to pick your subclass right away at level 1, but now I'm rethinking that praise, because Daggerheart classes are now even more front-loaded than even D&D's are. I mean front-loaded as in you get a lot of features just at level 1 through 3 in D&D and at level 1 in Daggerheart. It's not like in D&D, where when you multiclass, you have a number of levels in one class, and now one level in a new class. For instance, you can be a level 5 wizard that multiclassed into a rogue, so now you're a 5th level wizard and a 1st level rogue, for a total of a level of 6, and you only have access to what a 5th level wizard and a 1st level rogue can do. Spellcasting, Arcane Tradition, a wizard subclass, a single ABI from 4th level wizard, spell slots up to 3rd level, expertise from rogue, and also sneak attack from rogue. Where in Daggerheart, as soon as you multiclass, you gain all the features of that new class, the basic features of one subclass, and access to one domain of that class that you can now get domain cards from on preceding levels, so long as they are of a level 1/2 of your total level. That's a lot of stuff right away. So why should I ever focus on building up my subclass? I get way more for just one more advancement point to multiclass, and once you multiclassed or improved your subclass, you cannot do the other. Don't get me wrong, there are some good subclass abilities at higher subclass levels, but you can't really argue against the sheer amount of stuff you get just for multiclassing. Plus you can multiclass twice in Daggerheart. For a game that is attempting to streamline as much as possible for the sake of having the game be more focused on the role-playing of TTRPGs, Daggerheart is very much designed in a way that incentivizes its players to make builds that require them to keep track of a lot of stuff. If you choose to multiclass when available, then by the end of the game you will have access to 4 domains, 3 subclasses, and 3 to 5 class features. Doing a multiclass dip of 1 to 3 levels before returning to leveling your main class in D&D would arguably be giving players far less to keep track of than in Daggerheart's version of multiclassing. Yes, there are a lot of annoying things to keep track of when multiclassing in D&D, like how the multiclass spell slot progression works, or remembering that warlock spell slots are different than every other kind of spell slot in the game, or keeping track of multiple resources like bardic inspiration and sorcery points, or that multiclassing 2 martial classes does nothing to help you get additional attacks per action, and you will have to wait until level 6 to multiclass or else you will lose out on your second attack. But D&D has the player get access to those things far slower than in Daggerheart, which allows players to ease into accessing new abilities. Part of the reason why new players need to start at level 1 when making a new character for a new campaign, as slowly getting greater increments of power allows players to get used to small amounts of new things to track per level up. It is less overwhelming, and depending on what class you choose to play, is arguably just as easy to play as any Daggerheart character. So overall, the leveling up system does it again and takes a system that is relatively easy to understand in D&D and makes it needlessly more complicated. Of course, when I say that, I'm not saying that it's impossible for anyone to understand. Rather, it's just D&D's leveling system, but with extra steps, and that's annoying. Like I mentioned before, there are annoying things in D&D's leveling system, like figuring out how many spells you can have prepped as a spellcaster, but at least in D&D, you can just not play a spellcaster. In Daggerheart, I would much rather see that players get more health every level up, or every few level ups. Maybe that can be decided upon by what class you pick, like in D&D. I know Daggerheart wants to keep health pools low for simplicity's sake, but forcing players to spend resources just to get more health, stress, evasion, and proficiency feels shallow. I would much rather Daggerheart focus much more on the domain card system and flesh that out a lot more. Domain cards actually alter the way you play and give you interesting new abilities, along with being the spells in the game, but there are only 2 domain cards per level per domain, which is really limited. The equipment section is all about weapons and armor your character will bring with them on their adventures. On the first page of this section, I do not see anything exceptional or egregious, so I'll move on directly to looking at weapons and armor. All weapons and armor in this game are divided up by player tier, so to use certain weapons and armor, players must be a certain level. If you have ever played The Witcher 3, or any game inspired by Diablo, or even Borderlands, you're likely very familiar with this very annoying system. The downsides of the system are offset in that enemies are not dropping random loot, so you don't have to deal with the annoyance of finding good weapons you just can't use until higher levels. And typically, once you get to that level, the weapon is no longer worth using. The core issue of the system persists in that, why can't I use certain weapons that are already in the game? In D&D, the answer is typically, you haven't found it yet, or you can't afford it yet. But in Daggerheart, items have no assigned prices, so why can't I start the game with a legendary broadsword? Of course the answer is, because it would be OP and would break the balance of the game. But then why balance the weapons and armor in this way? In D&D, weapons scale off the player's strength or dexterity along with their proficiency, with damage being a set amount of dice with strength or dex added. So players technically never need to change weapons from their starting gear. I personally don't like that to some extent because I think using the same exact weapon without any change for the entire game is really boring. But of course, players usually switch to a magic weapon at some point in the game to deal with enemies who are resistant to non-magical weapons. But overall, I like the system because your increase to hit and increased damage is directly derived from your ability scores, or how you have decided to build your character, in other words. Of course, proficiency modifiers in D&D grow over time the more you level up, but it doesn't impact damage rolls, so the process is still almost entirely derived by the build the player has created for his character. But in Daggerheart, it's all tied very closely with the tier system. Your traits do affect your to-hit modifier for your weapons, so increasing your trait does help, but then the only other thing you add to it is experiences, which is gained through getting higher tiers. And then the damage is completely reliant on the tier system, since increasing proficiency, which can only be done when getting to new tiers, reflects how many dice you roll for damage. So having proficiency 3 means you roll a 3d8 for a broadsword instead of 1d8. And then using higher tier weapon variants increases their damage modifiers by about 3 per tier. So at tier 1, broadswords get nothing, and at tier 4, the modifier to damage is +9. Making damage in this game have pretty much nothing to do with your choices you made while building your character. You can use advancement options to increase your proficiency modifier by an additional +1 per tier, which is a choice players can make, but it also makes other options on the tier list, like improving your subclass, even less useful, since increasing your proficiency makes your character arguably better since you're just objectively doing more damage every time you hit. Something similar goes on with the armor in this game, since you can only wear better armor once you hit higher tiers. The only benefit to higher tier armors are higher damage thresholds, but there are some cool magic armors that players can only get at higher tiers. My issue with this is that it's really boring. In D&D, light armor has low AC, but you add all of your dex mod to it, or medium armor has middling AC, but you can only add at max +2 of your dex modifier to your AC, where heavy armor has a set AC and nothing can be added to it. For light armor, your build directly boosts your AC, with medium and heavy armor not having much nuance. But since heavy armor like plate is so expensive, players won't get access to high AC armor until later in the campaign, where high dex rogues will maintain competitive AC throughout the game by min-maxing their dexterity, making their build matter along with buying higher AC armor feel impactful, because players need to make money first, making for delayed gratification. Another big problem with weapons and armor being bound to tiers in this game is that, when should I give players higher tier equipment? Should I do it as soon as they get to the proper tier to use better equipment? I haven't looked at the adversaries and environment section of this book yet, but is the game balanced around players getting better gear right away? Or does lower tier gear remain competitive even after players level out of that tier? There are issues to both being true, since why have different tiers of armor if lower tiers remain just as usable as higher levels? Or, it's arguably bad design that as soon as players get to new tiers, they need to drop everything and get higher tier equipment, or else get their asses kicked because their equipment isn't min-maxed. Equipment has no monetary value assigned to it either, so you can't even interpret through how expensive certain items are on when players should start getting access to certain items. In D&D, players are generally supposed to get a certain amount of gold per level, and that can guide DMs into figuring out what kind of items players should have access to at what level. How much money players should get per level is not mentioned in the 5e rulebook anywhere, but can be easily found through a Google search. So if you want to ignore that point, go ahead, but Daggerheart has no monetary values assigned to its equipment at all, so you can't even independently figure out how much money players should get per level and the kind of items they should be allowed to access with that money. The book does not explain what you should do, another instance of the book leaving too much of how the game should be paced and balanced up to the GM. Chapter 3. Chapter 3 is all about DMing. I really appreciate that Daggerheart didn't split up their books into 3 separate ones like what D&D does with its player handbook, DM's guide, and monster manual. It keeps all the information needed to play in one place that anyone can reference. This is enhanced by the cards in the game, since the cards make it so players need to refer to the book less, allowing the DM to monopolize the book more. GM principles, GM best practices, and pitfalls. These sections mostly retread what was said in the intro of the game and touch on things almost any DM will know. It's useful for new DMs, but experienced ones can skip this section. Core GM mechanics. The GM's die. Under the GM's die section, it describes that the GM uses a 1d20 instead of 2d12 like players. I don't really understand why they have it this way, because all this does is make the game more player-centric than it already is. Because as I said before, rolling a critical for 2d12 is much more common than rolling a critical for a 1d20. The players objectively have an advantage over the GM. It even says as such in the section. The section describes that it made this decision because it thinks that 2d12s make for more reliable outcomes. That's probably true, and I think that's part of the problem. The section even says that the swing nature of d20's results helps facilitate a variety of outcomes during sessions, but that's only true for the DM. An easy DC in D&D is like 10, and rolling a 10 with 2d12 is a lot easier than rolling a 10 with a 1d20. So it seems like the game is trying to make it more enjoyable for players to play because they will get more consistently positive results, as opposed to the DM who will have to deal with the wild nature of the 1d20 all by themselves, resulting in players succeeding more often than not. I also don't like the asymmetric design because that incentivizes GMs and players to play in very different ways. In D&D, or really any TTRPG, enemies can do things that players can't, and GMs can often make things up on the spot that monsters can do to make combat more interesting. The problem is that sometimes that feels unfair, because enemies that seem to have generally the same ability as players can do a bunch of stuff that players can never do, which makes for combat or other situations that feel really unfair because it feels like the GM is pulling shit out of their ass to railroad the game in the direction they want. That's why I think it's really important when you have NPCs that can cast magic, that their magic works in the exact same way as the players. That way the players understand what's happening and don't feel cheated when an NPC uses a spell that players can use as well. Making GM rolls. So for the Making GM rolls section, it just talks about how to roll to hit players. It works exactly how it does in D&D, where you roll a 1d20 and add your attack bonus from the enemy's stat block and determine if it meets or beats the player's evasion. If it does damage. But the description then says, quote, if you ever want to increase the chance of an adversary hitting a player, you can increase or decrease the attack modifier. I assume this means in prep, when choosing and/or modifying stat blocks, you can increase the attack modifier if you want to. But it doesn't say that explicitly, so potentially you could do this mid-combat if you want to. Technically you can do the same in D&D, increase attack mod mid-combat, but you're not really supposed to. Calling for action rolls work just like how it does in D&D. When a player wants to perform an action that includes a risk of failure, you will tell them what to roll, and they need to make a check to see if they succeed in an action. This section describes letting PCs guarantee success in exchange for consequences, establishing the stakes, and making clear any guaranteed consequences. This is all stuff that's already in D&D, maybe not explicitly written out, but this section can be useful for new DMs. Making moves. I already spoke about this a little bit earlier, but when play goes to the GM, or in other words, it becomes the GM's move, it's described as, quote, you are not bound by specific spells you can cast or certain effects you can do. When you make GM moves, you are acting to shape and facilitate the story, whatever that requires, end quote. A description that makes sense for social or exploration encounters, but when it comes to combat, that's a pretty loose description. It then says when you're done, play passes back to the players, which makes sense. The description goes on to describe how to handle the back and forth between players and GMs, in the sense that when players fail or roll a fear, the GM needs to have something bad happen to the player to make things feel like there are consequences. I talked about it earlier, but this is already kind of built into TTRPGs in the form of ability check sequences or just DM player back and forth. It's nice that it's written out like this in Daggerheart, because it's nice for new DMs to see it written out. But any GM who knows what they're doing already knows how to facilitate this in-game without needing it to be an official initiative system of the game. So I'm reading the obvious move section, and it says this, quote, a PC just rolled a success with fear on a melee attack against a powerful adversary. They get what they want, but it comes with a cost. In response, your move might have the adversary strike back or throw the PC across the battlefield, end quote. The more I read descriptions like this, the more I feel like Daggerheart is doing everything it can to be more like a Monster of the Week system. What I mean by that is that in Monster of the Week, when you make an attack roll against an enemy, if you succeed, you do damage to the enemy, and if you fail, you suffer damage from the enemy, immediately counter-attacking. I know from watching Age of Umbra, this is not quite how it works, as initiative in player and enemy interaction works a bit more like how it does in D&D, rather than Monster of the Week. But all these descriptions keep adding up to feel like how you're supposed to play this game is to have players attack enemies, and then if they fail or roll or fear, the enemy should immediately attack them back and do some damage. Everything in this game, like using fear to give enemies more spotlights before you let initiative go back to the players, is kind of like a hacked together system to make it less like Monster of the Week and more like D&D, and I just don't feel like it always works well, because this game wants to be a tactical game like D&D or Pathfinder, but its initiative system, its movement system, its fear system are not really tactical at all. Avoid undermining your players. So here's an interesting section I think I talked about a little bit earlier as well, but I'll talk about it again. Avoiding undermining a successful player in this game at its core is impossible, because success with fear exists in this game, and it's been described throughout the book as requiring the player needing to suffer a negative consequence when they roll it. Earlier, it did give us a distinction between failing a roll with fear, failing a roll with hope, succeeding with hope, and succeeding with fear, and that succeeding with fear and failing with fear should have a tangible difference. But there has been sections throughout this book where success with fear has still been described with pretty harsh consequences, and I think that's bad for player enjoyment of this game. In D&D, when you succeed at something, you just succeed. There is no nuance to it. Some might not like that, but it's simple and straightforward, which I find to be better for roleplay and other forms of play. But in Daggerheart, even when you meet or beat the DC of whatever action you're taking, you can still be undermined because the game at its core requires you to be undermined, since success with fear requires the player to suffer a negative consequence despite succeeding, which I think is fundamentally unfun. This description talks about ways GMs can have players suffer a negative consequence without undermining them by saying that the negative consequence should essentially have nothing to do with what the player is succeeding at. Quote, a PC might circumvent a trap you laid. Rather than immediately use a GM move to spring the trap into working, let the PC feel smart as you instead use your next GM move to summon more foes or to telegraph what other dangers might be in the path ahead. End quote. But there might be several circumstances where that just might not be an option. Earlier, I used the example of a rogue trying to infiltrate an enemy base and the different outcomes from succeeding or failing a check. And I'll use it again. If players succeed on their stealth check, but with fear, then they're detected, or otherwise it gets harder to not be detected. In a situation like this, how would you make a GM move be something that doesn't really relate to the player's success? Nothing feels worse than successfully hitting an enemy and doing damage to them in combat, only for initiative to flip to the enemies because you rolled success with fear. Example GM moves. I already talked about this section a little bit earlier. Again, if you're a GM that has GM'd before, most of these things you will already know and use without need of a move system, but it can be really helpful for new GMs to learn how to GM. Fear. I already talked about fear earlier, so I won't talk about it again here. Setting roll difficulty. Setting roll difficulty works a lot like D&D or really any other TTRPG. I like the little graphic Daggerheart uses to represent it in the book. I might try to mimic that in my own game, just for visual clarity. This section also talks about using degrees of success, but again does not describe it in much detail. It essentially describes it like how it's often used in D&D when making a history check. How meeting the DC gets you the info you wanted, but rolling a nat 20 basically lets you take a peek at the GM's notes on the subject of interest. Difficulty rolls work like how they do in D&D. The book then gives us many examples for the kinds of things certain rolls for each trait can achieve. Unnecessary to include, but extremely helpful for new GMs, or even GMs with more experience, but not masters. I know I struggled with knowing where to set DCs in D&D for a long time, and often set them way too high to safeguard against min-maxing players. Little did I know that I was harming the enjoyment of my campaign for my players by doing so. So having clear examples for how hard certain actions should be is great. Adversary rolls. This relates to attacks and reaction rolls. They work a lot like how they do in D&D. Extra stuff. And then we get to a bunch of stuff I don't think I really need to talk about in detail here. There are class hope features which require a couple hope to use. Then there are countdowns, which work a lot like how they do in Blades of the Dark. I don't think going into it that much is really needed, but they come in a couple different forms. There is a standard countdown, which is based on how many players' moves are made. There is a dynamic countdown, which is based on player input and is more roleplay focused. There are chase countdowns, which work like normal countdowns, which are counted down based on how many player moves are made. And there is long-term countdowns, which can last in-game weeks or months. There is a gold equipment and loot section. I talked about gold and loot earlier and my problems with them. This section isn't really talking about that. Rather, this section is talking about distributing gold and loot amongst players when they find it. It's not a very needed section. I think most players will intuitively know that when you get gold and loot, you should distribute it amongst your party, not just hoard it for yourself. The running GM NPCs section just talks about some basic guidelines and advice for running NPCs, stuff that any GM will know, but newer GMs might like reading this section just to learn about how it works. GM PCs can also have NPC features, which are kind of like reactions enemies have, or they are abilities that can be triggered and can do special things. I'm skipping over a lot of this stuff because I don't really have anything positive or negative to say about any of it. I think it's all generally fine to good, so I'm just going to move on. The book then talks about optional GM mechanics like fate rolls, which are just rolling chance die. Essentially, it's like luck checks in D&D, where you just roll a straight d20, and whenever you roll determines what you get, but in Daggerheart you just roll your hope die and see what you roll. Moving and finding underwater is explained. All attack rolls have a disadvantage underwater, which makes sense. More interestingly, it brings up conflict between PCs, and it doesn't give a lot of description to it. It just says that if players do come into conflict, they should have a long talk about what should be rolled to resolve the conflict. This really does make me wonder, how would PvP even work in this game with its initiative system? Like, I don't think it would work at all with how the initiative system is set up. How would you switch from one player to the next? Do you just run it like normal initiative? Or once a player takes a move, the next player takes a move? Or do you wait until one player rolls with fear or fails, and then switch to the other player and let them go until they roll with fear or failure? It's not really defined, but that's arguably okay, because generally speaking, you really don't want your players to engage in PvP. It can really sour the session if not handled correctly. Conclusion. I know I complained at the start of the video that other creators who reviewed Daggerheart didn't go into much detail. Unfortunately, it has taken me an extremely long amount of time to review this game properly up to this point, and I think I've done a detailed critique so far. Unfortunately, I do not have the time or energy to go into Chapter 4, Adversaries and Environments, and I already said I wasn't going to go into Chapter 5 at the beginning of the video. Hate me if you want for ending it where I am, but I know for a fact that my deep dive into Daggerheart has been by far and away more detailed than many other Daggerheart reviews or critiques or thought videos out there. On to the conclusion proper. I think the big question that many want answered is Daggerheart a D&D killer? Frankly, no, it's not. I think Daggerheart's biggest issue is that I really don't know what demographic this game is for. Is it for the real light community who essentially want no combat in their TTRPG experiences and have the entire game be mostly about roleplay like Monster of the Week or Blades in the Dark? The experience system, lack of restrictions on items and abilities descriptions, and initiative system are all highly supportive of a rules light way of play, with letting players do what they want and really only letting enemies do stuff when players fail, making the game a very reactionary system. Or is it supposed to be more of a D&D game that has well-defined rules and focused on tactical combat with maps, ranges having specific definitions, the rigidity of classes, along with the complex armor and damage conversion system making the game much more system-driven makes it seem so. Daggerheart is trying to be a rules medium system, a diet D&D if you would. Even though looking online, that isn't even true since a lot of people consider D&D 5e to be a rules medium system, which means Daggerheart is trying to be between rules medium and rules light, rules mediumer, I guess. A very specific niche, a niche that I'm not sure there's a big crowd for, but Shadow Dark seems pretty similar to Daggerheart superficially, and that game was very successful from what I remember. But even then, I think Daggerheart fails at being a diet D&D game because of its strange attempts to maintain the tactical nature of D&D while needlessly changing rules to be slightly more complicated, seemingly in an attempt to make the game less complicated. The armor system, the damage conversion system, rolling with fear system, the experience system, ranges, movement, tracking gold, death not meaning anything, and leveling up not differentiating classes post level 1 all add up to make a game that feels very awkward and underdeveloped. Like, Daggerheart has player health relatively small in this game, seemingly to make the game feel more lethal, but then their death mechanics has an option to simply ignore dying, with the trade-off being that maybe you'll get a scar, the likelihood of getting a scar becoming less and less the more you level up. One of the biggest D&D 5e criticisms I hear about online is that 5e lacks rules or guidelines on how to conduct social situations in-game. In Mythic, I tried to address this issue by straight up making a combat-esque system for social situations where different speaking tactics could be used to deplete health bars of sorts that, when depleted, represent a player winning a social encounter or a conversation. And when I showed it to my players, they didn't like it. They prefer the much more freeform way already done in D&D. After thinking on it for some time, I think they're right in the sense that the roleplay side of TTRPGs really shouldn't have much rules applied to them for social situations because social encounters in TTRPGs are just conversations, like in real life. And it's really hard to apply rules to that, beyond asking for a persuasion, intimidation, or deception check when players are pushing buttons. Daggerheart attempts to add rules and guidelines for social encounters when it describes how its initiative system works outside of combat, where when you fail a roll or roll with fear, you partially or fully fail in your speech check. But that isn't a rule for social encounters, that's just a rule for skill/ability/trait checks. And that is where I think Daggerheart really goes wrong, in that in its path to make a version of D&D that is more focused on roleplay, but maintains some tactical combat, somewhere along the way, it construed ability/trait checks for a way to give social encounter rules and guidelines. Because making a presence check is the same process as making a strength check. There are no rules for how they actually are applied out of combat and are just as freeform as in D&D. Walk up to a rock and tell your GM that your character lifts it? Okay, an impromptu strength check. The same goes for presence. Your character walks up to a horse salesman and tries to convince him to give the party a horse for less than the asking price. Impromptu presence check. The same goes for the basic mechanic in the game, that is getting hope back when you roll for hope on your 2d12 roll, or fear on your 2d12 roll. Getting hope through rolling die doesn't magically make your players want to roleplay more, despite what the mechanic seems to be wanting to do. Instead, it incentivizes players to simply roll dice more often, which isn't roleplaying more. 5 of the 6 traits in this game have nothing to do with roleplay. The single roleplay trait is presence, and yet the main way to get hope back is to simply roll with all these traits. So, a game that is D&D but focusing more on the roleplay side of the game isn't actually doing anything to focus on the roleplay side of the game. It just wants you to make more skill checks per session to get hope back or generate fear for the GM. So both the GM and player can have full access to all their options in combat. It only gets worse when looking at leveling up and how items work in this game. Daggerheart has almost completely divorced player build from how effective their player actually is in game, both in and out of combat. So if you're playing a wizard character, there's nothing stopping them from getting a legendary broadsword at level 8 and rolling 3d8 per hit in this game and being competitive or doing more damage than other builds, despite Wizard's traditional role in role-playing games being more focused on magic, crowd control, buffing allies, and debuffing enemies. Classes don't need to be that rigid. I know I like the idea of a muscle wizard as much as the next guy, but allowing players to easily fill multiple roles will make other classes completely redundant. Like, why would I ever play a warrior in this game when I could just play a wizard that also focuses on strength or dex and can wield a weapon as effectively as a warrior and do as much or more damage, along with casting powerful spells? Which leads into my criticism that Daggerheart does a lot in this game that removes the mechanical roleplay that you typically find in TTRPGs. In D&D, a barbarian is a barbarian because they rage, they focus strength and constitution, and they serve as the tank in combat. Where the wizard is physically frail, they can't do a lot in melee, but they can do crazy spells that can really help the entire team and keep many enemies at bay at once. With multiclassing and subclasses in D&D, you can kind of work around those role restrictions, but for the most part, when you pick a class, you are that class. For instance, you can be a Bladesinger wizard, which allows you to play a wizard that is much more confident in melee and can actually do competent melee damage. The problem being that they still have a tiny amount of health, so if they do get hit, they're going to go down really fast, and honestly, they might still be better off sitting in the back line casting Fireball from afar. So overall, my final thoughts on Daggerheart is that I personally don't see anything in this game that makes me want to play it over just playing D&D. Players technically always being initiative, how fear is used in a very awkward way both in and out of combat, how the armor system works and how I have to convert damage every single time I take a hit, failing and rolling with fear on checks, the death mechanic being flaccid, the goal tracking mechanic being weird, lacking significant distinctions between classes post level 1, and equipment being bound to tiers make for a version of D&D that is just a lot more awkward and less thought out. There are some good changes made from D&D to Daggerheart that I like traits being only 6 base traits and not needing to convert an ability score into an ability modifier to actually reference or domain cards, which are a great addition to the game, and I think in the next edition, they should just get rid of subclasses and just add more domain cards to the game. It would be a far better way to differentiate 2 PCs of the same class without needing a subclass, because then they have a wider variety of cards to pick from, which will naturally have them building a more unique build based on what domain cards they pick. Do I think Daggerheart is bad? No, in no way do I think Daggerheart is bad. A lot of systems I've talked about in this game that I don't like and think are clunkier and a little more complicated than what they are in D&D are still fully functional and work perfectly fine. The armor system, for instance, while definitely having a lot more to it than D&D has, is still fine for the most part and is still relatively easy to reference. It's just objectively more complicated than how it works in D&D. So while I might not prefer it, you might, and that's okay. I'm not going to give you some snooty, snarky video essayist answer about how, oh, it's okay to like bad things. Because that's not where I'm coming from. I don't think Daggerheart is bad at all. I don't think anyone who plays Daggerheart or likes it should feel bad about it, because it really is a perfectly fine system that can be a lot of fun. It just makes a lot of weird changes from D&D that really doesn't help in the game's 2 main goals, be more roleplay focused and maintain the tactical nature of the game. Do I think Daggerheart is a D&D killer when it comes to influence? Possibly yes. But that's not because of the quality of its mechanics. As I'm sure many people watching this know, Critical Role and Daring to Impress are huge IPs at this point in the TTRPG community. When Daggerheart first came out, it was sold out almost immediately everywhere. I definitely think Daggerheart has a chance to have greater influence than D&D ever did, especially nowadays with Wizard of the Coast and Hasbro making so many stupid fucking decisions that a dry shit on the ground can look better than their company. Critical Role and Daring to Impress hasn't done anything in recent years that has been worth calling scandalous. I've been following Critical Role for a long time, since Campaign 1. As far as I can remember, However, there has never been a scandal of any kind with them, other than their psycho fans. Critical Role has a great reputation. People are ravenous for it. So whether Daggerheart was good or bad, in the end it was always going to be highly influential because the people behind the game were already incredibly influential. Daggerheart literally couldn't fail, and everyone's too scared to be blacklisted from Critical Role and Darien Press, and probably Critical Role's psycho fans, to actually say anything consequential about this game. Daggerheart is a great system for GMs that have never GM'd any TTRPG before. The game's initiative system, how a spotlight goes to the GM in reaction to players, and how plainly the GM section is written, makes this a great document for any kind of new GM to read at least once to get a handle on the basics of GMing. But I think players, even new ones, will be bored with this game due to its far more shallow mechanics and build variety compared to D&D. So overall, if you like D&D and are simply curious about trying Daggerheart, I don't recommend switching systems. GMing the game can be weird with the fear system and players will be bored. But for people new to TTRPGs, Daggerheart might be a good place to start.